Aki and the Bramblewick Café, Chapter 1, Ears in the Crowd. The city was never truly quiet. Even at this late hour, the distant hum of engines and the occasional sharp cry of a voice echoed through the narrow streets. Neon signs buzzed faintly in the misty rain, their flickering light casting strange reflections onto the slick pavement. Somewhere nearby, water dripped steadily from a broken gutter, the rhythm lost amidst the muffled chaos of the world beyond. In a cramped room on the edge of a forgotten district, Aki sat perched on the edge of his single bed, his ears twitching at the sounds that seeped through the thin walls. The rain brought a cold dampness that clung to everything, but Aki hardly noticed. His gaze was fixed on a small stuffed toy resting in his lap, a soft, worn creature with threadbare fur and a button eye barely hanging on by a thread. Momo, his only real companion. The room was sparse, its walls peeling with damp patches spreading like bruises. A single bulb hung gently from the ceiling, casting a dim yellow glow that struggled to reach the corners. On a rickety shelf by the bed sat a faded photograph of his parents, their smiles frozen in a moment that felt like it belonged to another life. Beside it lay a knitted blanket, frayed and patched in places, yet still carrying the faintest scent of home. This was Aki's sanctuary, or the closest thing to one the city could offer. It wasn't much, but it was safe enough for now. Here, in these four walls, he could let the mask of quiet servitude slip, if only for a little while. His tail curled loosely around his side as he glanced at the clock on the wall, its hands ticking steadily toward the early hours of morning. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and with it, another long day at the cafe. He could already imagine the sharp words from his manager, the demanding customers, and the mocking laughter that always seemed to cut a little deeper than it should. Aki lay down on the thin mattress, letting out a soft sigh. He closed his eyes, and for a brief moment the noise of the city faded, replaced by a quiet memory of something softer, a distant fragment of laughter, the warmth of a hand ruffling his ears, the feeling of being cherished, even if just for a moment. But the memory slipped away as quickly as it had come, leaving behind only the faint ache of longing. Aki's ears flattened slightly, and he pulled Momo closer, as if the toy's presence could shield him from the weight of the city pressing in around him. The rain outside grew heavier, the steady drumming on the windows lulling him into a restless sleep. And as the neon lights outside flickered and buzzed, the city carried on, indifferent to this small, fragile soul tucked away in its shadows. The rain was still falling when Aki woke, the grey light of morning creeping hesitantly through the grime-streaked window. He sat up slowly, the cool air brushing against his skin as his blanket slipped aside. A faint yawn escaped his lips as his ears twitched, swivelling instinctively toward the faint sounds of the city stirring to life. They were large, soft-furred triangles perched atop his head, their subtle movements often betraying emotions he worked hard to keep hidden. His tail, long and slender, draped across the bed like an afterthought, twitching idly as he swung his legs over the side, the tufted tip brushing the floor. At first glance, it was clear that Aki was no ordinary young man. His slight, almost fragile frame and graceful movements were far more delicate than those of an average human male his age. His light step and quiet alertness hinted at an otherworldly agility and balance that seemed effortless. Even in stillness, there was a sense of poise about him, as though he might spring into motion at any moment. For Aki was a neko, a rare hybrid of human and feline. These traits weren't just physical quirks. They were a constant reminder of what he was. Though his delicate stature and gentle demeanour set him apart, it was his neko features that truly marked him as different. Now in his late teens, Aki had long since learned what it meant to carry that identity. Neckos were often regarded as little more than curiosities. Some found them endearing with their timid manners and feline traits, while others viewed them as second-class citizens, easy targets for ridicule and exploitation. Their small, fragile stature and gentle nature left them defenceless against humans, whose sheer strength and dominance rendered any opposition not just futile, but dangerous. With no means to protect themselves, they learned to navigate the world with the quiet caution of prey, their every action carefully measured to avoid drawing the wrong kind of attention. Most learned early that even the smallest acts of defiance could invite hostility or violence, and so they endured, relying on submission as their only shield. It was this very gentleness, this childlike inability to protect themselves, that marked them as vulnerable in a way many humans found irresistible to exploit. To some, they were little more than toys to be played with or broken, their fragility seen not as a call for kindness, but as an opportunity for power and dominance. As a boy, Aki had watched his parents endure the same struggles he now faced: menial work, poor wages, and the constant need to endure fear and humiliation in silence. "Keep your head down," they had always said. "Don't draw attention. It's much safer that way." But safer never meant easier. The faint morning light filtered into the room, casting a muted glow over the small space. Aki sat up slowly, the cool air brushing his skin as his blanket slipped to the side. His gaze fell on Momo, the worn stuffed toy resting on the pillow beside him. It had been with him since childhood, its faded fur a quiet reminder of simpler times. He reached out, his fingers brushing over the fabric with a tenderness that felt almost automatic. Though the toy was small and unassuming, it held a significance for Aki that words couldn't capture. A piece of safety and warmth he could return to, even when the world outside felt cold and unkind. With a soft sigh, he set Momo carefully back onto the pillow, as if ensuring its safety before he left. Only then did he rise, stretching his small frame as the chill of the room seeped into his skin. Crossing to the chair by the corner, he grabbed his uniform, a simple button-up white shirt and black trousers, neatly draped over the backrest. He slipped into the clothing with practiced efficiency, smoothing the fabric with quick, deliberate movements. Passing by the cracked mirror near the door, Aki caught sight of his reflection. His features were delicate, softer than most humans his age. His eyes carried a warmth that belied the exhaustion he felt, and the faint shadows beneath them hinted at sleepless nights. He looked closer, scanning the features that set him apart. His large, soft ears perched atop his head, his long, slender tail swaying faintly behind him. A part of him wondered, not for the first time, what life would be like without them, without the ears, without the tail, without the mark of what he was. Would humans treat him differently? Would they even notice him at all? His gaze shifted to the photograph of his parents on the shelf, their familiar smiles frozen in time. Bittersweet memories flickered to life. His mother's soothing hand brushing over his ears, his father's quiet strength during the hardest days. They were gone now, leaving Aki to navigate the same harsh world on his own. The ache of their absence settled in his chest, familiar but never easier to bear. The thought lingered as he put on his coat and picked up his satchel. With one last glance around the room, he stepped out into the hallway, where the faint smell of mildew and stale air greeted him. The world outside was waiting, and Aki knew it wouldn't be kind. But for now, all he could do was face it. The air outside was sharp and damp, carrying the mingled scents of wet concrete, exhaust fumes, and the faint bitterness of stale beer from the bar downstairs. Aki pulled his coat tighter around him as he stepped onto the cracked pavement, his shoes splashing lightly in a shallow puddle. The morning rush was already underway, a tide of humanity streaming past him without a glance. Men and women in heavy coats hurried to catch buses or trains, umbrellas tilted against the rain. Aki fell into step with the crowd, keeping his head low and his tail tucked close to avoid brushing against anyone. Even in the swarm of bodies, he felt exposed. His ears, despite his best efforts to flatten them against his head, were a beacon of difference, drawing the occasional curious or judgmental stare. Every glance made his chest tighten, a quiet but familiar unease. He had learned to keep moving, to give them no reason to linger. The cafe where he worked wasn't far, tucked into the corner of a busy street where the city's pulse beat loudest. The bell above the door jingled faintly as he stepped inside, and the familiar scent of coffee and pastries greeted him. Aki slipped behind the counter, hanging his coat on a hook in the back room. The uniform he wore was clean but ill-fitting, the sleeves slightly too long and the fabric worn thin at the elbows. He smoothed it as best he could before slipping on his barista's apron and stepping out to prepare for the morning rush. The cafe was already filling up, the hum of voices rising as customers claimed their seats. Aki moved quietly and swiftly through the space, his hands quick and practiced as he wiped down tables, cleared away dishes, and delivered steaming mugs of coffee to waiting patrons. Most customers barely noticed him beyond his service, their eyes fixed on their phones or conversations. But others noticed, too much. "Hey, you!" a voice called from the corner, cutting sharply through the cafe's din. Aki froze for half a second, his tail flicking nervously before he forced it still. Turning slowly, his ears flattened instinctively, though he kept his polite smile in place. At a table near the window sat a group of young men in cheap suits, their laughter already grating. One of them, a man with slicked-back hair and a smug expression, leaned back in his chair, lazily gesturing for Aki to approach. "You're a Neko, right?" the man asked, his voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby tables. His tone wasn't friendly or genuinely curious. It carried a deliberate edge, the kind meant to entertain his friends at someone else's expense. "Do those ears actually work, or are they just for show?" Aki's ears twitched involuntarily at the question, but he answered calmly, keeping his tone even. "They work just fine, sir," he said softly, his grip tightening slightly on the tray he carried. "Are you ready to place your order?" The man exchanged a glance with his friends, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Sure," he said, leaning back further in his chair. "We'll have 4 lattes, extra foam and no cat hairs. Think you can handle that?" As Aki jotted the order down, another man leaned toward his friend with a sly grin, his voice just loud enough for Aki to hear. "Do they charge extra if he coughs up a fur ball?" The group erupted into snickering laughter, the mocking tone slicing through Aki's careful composure as his ears flattened briefly at the jab, but he nodded quickly. 4 lattes, extra foam, anything else?" The first man leaned forward suddenly, his smirk widening. "Yeah, make 'em quick. We don't have all day, cat boy." Their laughter and mocking meow sounds followed Aki as he stepped away. The sharpness of their ridicule lingered, cutting deeper than he cared to admit. His hands tightened on the tray as he made his way to the counter, his chest heavy with the weight of their jeers. His hands trembled slightly, and he exhaled slowly through his nose, trying to calm the tight knot of anxiety in his stomach. He knew better than to react. Even the smallest hint of defiance could turn the encounter dangerous. Like many other Neko, he had learned that essential lesson, the hard way. Back at the counter, he busied himself with the coffee machine, the hiss of steam and the grind of beans, a welcome distraction. He focused on the rhythm of his work, letting the sounds and motions steady him. "Don't let them get to you, dear," a quiet voice said from nearby. Aki glanced up to see one of the regulars, an older woman with kind eyes and a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. She smiled gently, her expression full of understanding. People like that try to make others feel small because they can't face their own insecurities, she said, her voice soft but steady. But you've got more dignity and grace in one finger than they've got between all of them, she said softly, her words carrying a quiet conviction that settled over him like a shield. You're everything they're too afraid to even try to be. For a moment, Aki felt the tightness in his chest ease. He nodded, offering her a small smile in return before handing her the cup of coffee she had ordered. Thank you, he said softly. The woman gave him a warm smile before returning to her seat. Aki watched her go, a faint warmth lingering from the brief exchange. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that not everyone saw him as less. The moment passed, and the cafe's chaos swept him back into its rhythm. The young men in the corner continued to laugh, their voices loud and grating, but Aki tuned them out as best he could. For now he focused on the work in front of him, moving quietly through the space as the day wore on. Aki and the Bramblewick Café, Chapter 2. Shadows in the rain. The rain had stopped by the time Aki stepped out of the cafe, but the streets were still slick, shimmering under the dim glow of the streetlights. The sky above was a curtain of deep grey, heavy with the promise of more rain later. He lingered just outside the door, letting the cool night air wash over him, a stark contrast to the oppressive warmth and noise of the cafe. The distant hum of traffic and the occasional splash of water as tyres rolled through puddles filled the quiet. Aki's ears flicked as he tugged his coat tighter against the damp chill that seemed to seep into everything. The long day had left him frayed. Harsh words and mocking laughter lingered in his mind, cutting deeper than they should, clinging to him like a shadow he couldn't shake. Though his expression had remained calm throughout the day, the tension in his chest hadn't eased. It was a constant he had learned to carry. Aki exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. For a moment he stood motionless, his gaze drifting down the empty, glistening street ahead. The faint glow of distant lights flickered in the puddles, and he wondered, just for a moment, how it might feel to walk in a place where the air didn't feel so heavy. Finally, he began the short walk home. The streets here were quieter than the bustling main roads, lined with aging tenements and shuttered shops. The cracked pavement beneath his feet was littered with cigarette butts and scraps of paper, remnants of lives that moved too quickly to care. This part of the city always felt forgotten, like a place people passed through without a second thought. For Aki, it wasn't just where he lived. It was the only home he'd ever known. He turned a corner and entered a narrow alley, the buildings on either side looming high and casting long shadows despite the overcast sky. The air here was different, thicker, heavier, carrying the faint, acrid smell of garbage and something metallic. Aki's steps faltered as his gaze fell on a figure slumped against the wall ahead. A fellow Neko. Her ears drooped low, her tail curled tightly around her knees as she clutched a threadbare blanket that did little against the cold. She looked so small, so fragile, and even though her face was turned away, the defeated slope of her shoulders was unmistakable. He stopped mid-step, the familiar ache tightening in his chest. The sight hit him harder than he expected, cutting through his usual numbness. She wasn't much older than him, and yet she seemed so worn down by the weight of the city, as though it had stripped her of everything except the will to survive. It wasn't the first time Aki had seen someone like this. Nekos huddled in alleys, forgotten on stoops, always part of the city's fabric, but never truly seen. Yet tonight it felt unbearable. He hesitated, torn between the urge to help and the painful reminder of his own limits. What could he really do? He could barely manage to scrape by himself, and yet walking away felt like a betrayal, like he was complicit in the world's cruelty. Swallowing hard, Aki reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wrapped pastry he'd managed to save from the cafe. His heart ached as he stepped closer, each movement slow and deliberate to avoid startling her. "Here," he said softly, his voice trembling with unspoken emotions as he held the pastry out. The Neko flinched at first, her wide eyes darting to his face, searching it as if unsure whether the offer was real. After a moment, she reached out with trembling fingers and took the pastry, her hands clutching it tightly like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice faint but laced with desperation. Aki nodded, his throat tightening as he fought to keep his emotions in check. "Take care," he whispered, though the words felt painfully hollow. As he turned and walked away, the image of her stayed with him. Each step felt heavier, the knot in his chest refusing to loosen. He hated how powerless he felt, how the city seemed to grind people like her and him into nothing more than shadows in its relentless machinery. It wasn't fair. None of it was. And yet, what could a single Nico do in a world that seemed designed to keep them small? The question burned in his mind, haunting him as he made his way back toward the tiny, dimly lit room he called home. The air was getting chillier. He pulled his coat tighter around him, glancing at the neon-lit streets ahead. His one-room apartment wasn't far, but the thought of returning to its quiet solitude didn't bring him the comfort it usually did. Instead, Aki found himself drawn to the small park a block away. It was little more than a patch of grass surrounded by a rusting fence, with a few benches scattered beneath the skeletal branches of winter-bare trees. He sat down on one of the benches, the wood cold and damp beneath him. For a moment he let himself close his eyes, the noise of the city fading into a distant hum. The ache in his chest felt heavier tonight, a quiet, gnawing sadness that he couldn't quite shake. Eki opened his eyes and looked up at the sky, where the faintest hints of stars peeked through the haze of city lights. His ears twitched at the sound of soft music drifting from a nearby apartment window, a gentle lilting melody that carried a sense of peace. He glanced toward the source, catching a glimpse of an older couple dancing slowly in their living room, their movements unhurried, their closeness unmistakable. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that kindness and warmth still existed, even here. Aki had lingered in the park longer than he'd intended. The cold had seeped through his coat, but he stayed where he was, his gaze fixed on the faint glow of the stars above. The world around him seemed quieter, save for the faint whisper of the breeze and the distant hum of the city. The sound of footsteps on gravel pulled him from his thoughts. He glanced up to see an older man walking a small dog, its fur curly and white like a puff of cloud. The dog's nose twitched as it caught sight of Aki and let out a soft, curious whine, tugging insistently on its leash until the man relented. "Evening," the man said, his voice warm but rough, like someone who had spent years in the cold. He was wrapped in a thick coat, his scarf frayed at the edges. The dog bounded up to Aki, sniffing at his feet before looking up at him, its bright eyes gleaming with an almost human-like eagerness. Aki hesitated before reaching out, his fingers brushing the soft fur behind its ears. The dog wagged its tail furiously, leaning into his touch. "That's odd," the man said, stopping a few feet away. His gaze lingered on Aki's ears and tail, not with judgment, but with open curiosity. "He doesn't usually take to strangers." Aki gave a faint smile, his hand still resting lightly on the dog's head. "He's friendly," he murmured. "Not always," the man said, watching the interaction closely. "He's usually shy, very choosy about who he lets near him, but he knows a kind soul when he meets one." Aki's ears twitched, and he glanced down, unused to receiving such comments. "I guess animals don't judge the same way people do," he said softly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. The man tilted his head slightly, studying Aki with a thoughtful expression. "You're not wrong there. Shame more people don't follow their lead." Aki froze, unsure how to respond. There was no mockery in the man's tone, just an honesty that caught him off guard. "You live nearby?" the man asked after a beat. Aki hesitated, his hand still absently petting the dog. It was a harmless question, but his past experience with strangers always left him wary. Still, something about the man's presence felt safe. "Yes, just a couple of blocks away," he said finally. The man nodded, his eyes softening with recognition. "I'm sure I've seen you around. You work at the cafe, right?" Aki nodded. The man nodded thoughtfully, a hint of admiration in his tone. "Yes, I thought it was you. I've seen you in there. It looks like hard work. Must be tiring." Aki offered a faint, polite smile and a small nod, but said nothing, unsure how to respond. The man didn't press, giving the leash a gentle tug. The dog whined in protest, but eventually relented, its bright eyes lingering on Aki as it was pulled away. "Well, good night," the man said softly as he turned to leave, his tone carrying a quiet sincerity. "Take care of yourself." Aki's ears twitched slightly, and he found himself replying softly, "Good night. Thank you." The faint jingle of the dog's tags faded into the darkness, leaving Aki sitting there, a peculiar warmth lingering from the brief exchange. For a moment, the park felt different, less cold, less lonely. The weight on his chest eased just slightly, and as he stood to leave, the stars above seemed to glow a little brighter. The streets were quieter now, the rush of evening commuters fading into the low hum of the city at night. Aki's footsteps echoed softly as he neared his building, his breath now more visible in the chill air. He had almost reached the stoop of his apartment block when a voice cut through the stillness behind him. "Hey, cat boy!" Aki froze, his ears flattening instinctively. The voice was slurred, heavy with drink, but the edge of aggression in it was unmistakable. He turned slowly to see two figures emerging from the shadows of the alleyway across the street. Young men, both human, their movements unsteady, but their eyes sharp. One of them grinned, his teeth catching the light of a nearby street lamp. "What's the rush, huh?" the taller one said, his voice loud in the stillness. "We just want to talk." Aki's chest tightened. He stepped back, his tail curling around his leg as his heart began to race. I need to get home," he said softly, his voice barely carrying across the street. The shorter man laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Home? What's a little mutt like you got waiting for him at home?" The taller one stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his grin widening as he tilted his head mockingly. "Oh, look at those ears," he sneered, before letting out an exaggerated meow sound. "Come on, don't be shy," he said, slurring his words, his grin widening. "We're just being friendly." Aki's mind raced. Despite Neko being extremely fast and agile runners, he knew running away could make things worse. It would likely ignite their predatory instincts, turning this into a hunt. Instead, he stayed rooted in place, his hands trembling as he clutched the strap of his satchel. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his words quivering in the cold night air. "Trouble?" the shorter man echoed, his tone mocking. Who said anything about trouble? We just want to know who's waiting for you at home. Bet it's someone real pretty, huh? The taller one gave out another loud, mocking, meowing sound. Then he spoke up. Yeah, and we're curious about those ears of yours. Maybe we want to see if they're real, or if they're stuck on, like people say they are. They both moved closer, and Aki took another step back, his pulse pounding in his ears. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to keep his voice steady. Please, just leave me alone. For a moment the taller man hesitated, his grin faltering as if something in Aki's tone had reached him. But the shorter one grabbed the taller man's arm, pulling him forward. What are you doing? He's just a stupid cat kid. You're not scared of him, are you? Aki's fingers gripped the strap of his satchel tighter, his whole body tense. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink. He had learned long ago that even the smallest reaction could provoke them into violence. The taller man's grin returned, but it was thinner now, less certain. He reached out, his hand brushing the tip of Aki's ear. Before he could react, a loud clatter echoed from the alley behind them. A trash can toppled over, sending an actual cat darting into the street. The noise startled them all, and for a split second, the men's attention shifted as they span around to look. Aki didn't wait. Seizing the moment, he darted up the stoop of his building, grabbing the keys in his pocket. His hand shook as he shoved the key into the lock, the sound of his heart drowning out everything else. The door opened, and he slipped inside, quickly and quietly closing it shut behind him. For several seconds, he leaned against the door, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. His ears twitched at the sound of muffled voices outside. But the men didn't follow. It seems in the distraction, they were too drunk to even see where Aki had disappeared to. Eventually, their voices and drunken laughter faded into the distance, leaving only the distant hum of the city. Aki sank to the floor, his back pressed against the door as he pulled his knees to his chest. His tail coiled tightly around his leg, and his entire body trembled, the weight of the encounter bearing down on him, the fear still coursing through him like an unrelenting tide. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. It wouldn't be the last. But tonight, as the city loomed around him, Aki felt the ache of it all. The fear, the helplessness, burning deeper than ever before. He exhaled shakily, dragging himself up the dim stairwell to the single room he called home, the only place in this city where he could feel even a sliver of safety. The stairwell leading up to Aki's apartment was dim and silent, the only sound the creak of old wood beneath his careful steps. He kept his ears low, listening for any signs of movement, though he knew the building was rarely lively. His hands were still trembling slightly as he unlocked his door and stepped inside. The familiar sight of his small, cluttered, one-room apartment greeted him, and for a moment he simply stood there, letting the quiet wrap around him like a thin but comforting blanket. Momo sat waiting on the bed, its worn button eyes glinting faintly in the light from the street lamp outside. Aki crossed the room and sank onto the mattress, the tension in his chest finally giving way to exhaustion. He reached out, taking the stuffed toy into his hands. The fabric was soft, frayed in places from years of handling, but it carried a sense of safety that nothing else could. Aki held it close, his ears drooping as he let his breathing slow. The encounter with the men replayed in Aki's mind, each detail sharper than the last. The way their voices had sliced through the night, cruel and taunting. The taller man's mocking grin, the deliberate meowing sounds, and the way his hand had roughly brushed his ear. It all made Aki's skin crawl. But it wasn't just the encounter itself. It was the fear that clung to him now, cold and suffocating, coursing through his chest in relentless waves. This wasn't new. It was the constant gnawing dread that shadowed every moment of his life in the city. always waiting, always bracing for the next reminder of how small and powerless he was in a world that seemed determined to crush him. Each time it happened, the weight of it pressed deeper into his soul, grinding away pieces he couldn't get back. It left him feeling raw, as if the ground beneath him might crumble at any moment, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the sense that he was losing pieces of himself, his confidence, his hope, and the small fragments of happiness he tried to hold on to. His gaze drifted down to Momo, his fingers brushing the toy's faded fur. The touch grounded him, but it didn't ease the ache in his chest. "I don't belong here," he whispered, his voice trembling, barely audible. After a long pause, he added, "I just want to be somewhere I can feel safe, somewhere I don't have to be afraid all the time." The city had always been a place of contrasts for Aki. There were moments of warmth, fleeting but real. A kind smile from a stranger, a gentle word from a regular at the cafe. But those moments were like tiny fleeting cracks of sunlight through storm clouds, brief and too easily overshadowed by the constant weight of survival. He closed his eyes, his tail curled loosely at his side, its slow, pensive movements mirroring the weight in his chest. There had to be something more than this, more than fear pressing in on all sides, more than enduring each day only to survive the next. The small joys felt so fleeting, swallowed whole by the relentless cruelties of the world. But what? The question lingered, unanswered, as Aki sat in the quiet of his apartment. The city outside buzzed with life, its sounds muffled but constant. He clutched Momo tighter, the faint ache of longing settling deep in his chest. And yet, even in the stillness, there was a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Not hope exactly, but a sense that the question itself mattered, that wanting something more wasn't foolish, even if the answer felt impossibly far away. Aki and the Bramblewick Café, Chapter 3. Strangers and Stars. The next day dawned grey and misty, the city wrapped in a damp chill that clung to everything. By the time afternoon rolled around, the cafe had settled into a quiet lull. The hum of conversation was low and subdued, the faint clink of cups, and the gentle hiss of the coffee machine blending into a comforting rhythm. Aki moved carefully between the tables, his tray balanced in one hand, his ears flicking now and then toward the scattered voices. The warmth of the cafe was a welcome shield against the cold, and for a brief moment the weight of the world outside felt a little lighter. The bell above the door jingled, and Aki glanced up. A young woman entered, pulling her scarf loose as she stepped inside, her cheeks pink from the cold. She was followed by a friend, their quiet laughter like a spark of energy in the otherwise still room. Aki approached their table after a moment, his steps measured and his voice soft. "Good afternoon," he said. "Can I get you anything to drink?" The young woman looked up, and Aki immediately felt the shift. Her gaze lingered, wide and unguarded, and he could see it, the unmistakable awe of someone seeing a Neko for the first time. It wasn't unusual. At least a few times a month, someone would come into the cafe and look at him like this, their curiosity as open and gentle as a child's. Still, something about the way she looked at him was different. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness, only wonder, as if she were afraid to blink and miss the moment entirely. "I'll have a latte," her friend said, barely glancing up as she fiddled with her phone. The young woman hesitated, her gaze fixed on Aki's ears. "I'll have the same," she said finally, her voice soft and warm. Aki nodded, gave her a subtle smile and turned toward the counter, his tail swaying lightly behind him. Encounters like this were familiar to him. Moments when humans, wide-eyed and fascinated, would ask about his ears or tail, sometimes even reaching out to touch them. For all the challenges of his job, these interactions were a rare bright spot. Most Nekos were happy to be someone's first encounter with their kind, and Aki was no exception. When he returned with their drinks, the young woman's smile deepened. "I hope you don't mind me asking," she began, her tone careful, "but are you a Neko?" Aki's ears twitched slightly. He smiled kindly and nodded. "Yes," he said softly, his voice steady but shy. Her smile widened, and a faint blush coloured her cheeks. "I've never met a Neko before," she said, her words tinged with quiet excitement. "Your ears, they're beautiful." Aki's breath froze for a moment, his cheeks warming. "Thank you," he replied, his tone barely above a whisper. Her friend glanced up, smirking. "You're going to make him blush," she teased before returning to her phone. But the young woman didn't seem to hear. Her gaze lingered on Aki, curiosity and hesitance softening her expression. I hope this isn't rude, and please feel free to say no," she began, her voice faltering slightly. "But would it be okay if I petted your ears?" Her cheeks flushed deeply. Aki hesitated for only a moment before his smile widened. He nodded. "Of course you can," he said softly. "And thank you for asking so kindly." Her hand rose slowly, tentative and gentle, as her fingers brushed delicately against the fur around his right ear. Aki closed his eyes, his ears flicking slightly under her soft, feather-light touch. Her warmth was calming, her movements careful, as if she were afraid of hurting him. "They're so soft," she murmured, her voice carrying quiet awe, the kind of wonder that felt almost childlike. A radiant smile lingered on her face, pure and unguarded. Her touch lingered for a heartbeat longer before she pulled back, her cheeks still flushed, but her expression glowing with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her smile shy but radiant. "That was so lovely." "You're very welcome," Aki replied gently, smiling, his voice calm as he straightened. As he walked away, he felt a quiet warmth settle in his chest. Encounters like this were familiar, but her sweetness made this one feel different, like a gift, something rare and fleeting. For the rest of the afternoon, the memory of her gentle touch stayed with him, like the faint glow of sunlight breaking through clouds. The evening rush began with a sharp jingle of the cafe door, the sound almost swallowed by the sudden burst of chatter and footsteps. Aki moved quickly between tables, his tray balanced carefully as he cleared dishes and delivered drinks. The warmth from the earlier encounter lingered faintly, but the demands of the growing crowd soon pressed it into the background. Customers called for refills, chairs scraped against the floor, and the faint buzz of impatience filled the air like static. Aki's tail flicked nervously as he wove through the chaos, his ears twitching at the sound of his manager's sharp voice from the counter. "Hurry up! Table 5's been waiting too long." "Yes, ma'am," Aki replied quickly, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. He hurried to the table, offering a polite smile as he placed the tray down. "You call this service?" the man at the table snapped, his tone loud enough to draw attention. His suit was crisp, his watch gleaming under the cafe lights, and his glare was sharp enough to make Aki's ears flatten. "I'm very sorry, sir," Aki said, keeping his voice soft and even. "I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." The man scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "You're lucky we're even here. Can't imagine the tips are good when you've got freaks like you serving." Aki's tail curled tightly against his leg, but he didn't respond. He simply nodded, retreating quickly to the counter. Behind the safety of the espresso machine, Aki exhaled slowly, his hands trembling as he adjusted the coffee grinder. His reflection caught in the polished stainless steel surface of the machine, and he saw the faint droop in his ears, the slight tremor in his shoulders. He looked away quickly, focusing instead on the rhythmic motions of his work. The evening wore on, the rush eventually fading into a quieter hum. By the time the last customer left, Aki's legs ached, and his tail drooped with exhaustion. He'd spent the last hour cleaning, wiping down tables, stacking chairs, and mopping the floor, his movements efficient and quiet. As he stepped into the crisp night air, the sting of the man's words from earlier still clung to him, a faint echo of the day's harshness. But Aki let it fade, focusing instead on the sweeter memory of the girl's gentle touch and kind words. The cool breeze brushed against him, steadying his heart. The streets were quieter now, the rush of the day giving way to the stillness of the late evening. Aki adjusted his coat and started toward home, his steps measured and deliberate. And though the weight of the day pressed heavily on him, a small thought surfaced, unbidden but persistent. He had made it through another one. The narrow streets of Aki's neighbourhood seemed quieter than usual as he made his way home, the muted sounds of the city a low hum in the distance. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and shining under the dim glow of streetlights. Aki paused near a small courtyard tucked between two aging buildings. He rarely stopped here, but tonight something about the stillness drew him in. The space was simple, just a patch of uneven cobblestones and a weathered bench beneath a bare tree. A faint breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the soft rustle of leaves from nearby shrubs. As he stood there, a quiet voice broke the silence. "You don't see many neckos out this late?" Aki turned, his ears twitching at the sound. Sitting on the bench was another neko, older than him by a few years, her dark ears flicking back as she studied him. Her coat was patched and worn, but her eyes were sharp and clear. "I just finished work," Aki replied softly, stepping closer but keeping a respectful distance. The older neko smiled faintly, gesturing to the bench. "You look tired, like you could use a rest." Aki hesitated for a moment before sitting down, his tail curling neatly around his legs. They sat in silence for a while, the quiet night settling around them. Then, without looking at him, the older neko spoke again. "You've got that look," she said, her tone knowing but kind, "like you're carrying the whole city on your back." Aki blinked, surprised by the accuracy of her words. "It's not easy," he murmured, his voice barely carrying above the night's stillness. "It rarely is," she replied, her gaze drifting into the distance. "This city takes everything and gives nothing back. People like us? We don't have much left to lose, but it keeps taking anyway." Aki's ears drooped slightly as he glanced at her, the heaviness of her words settling in his chest. "But why does it have to be this way?" he asked softly, the question more for himself than for her. She sighed, a quiet sound that carried years of weariness. "I don't know," she said, her tone tinged with bitterness, but not cruelty. "It's all I've ever known. I'm guessing it's the same for you." Aki nodded slightly, and the flick of his tail betrayed the unease her words stirred within him. The older neko leaned back, her hands resting in her lap. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked, her tone lighter, but her eyes serious. Aki hesitated. The thought had crossed his mind many times, always fleeting but persistent, like a whisper he couldn't quite ignore. "Sometimes," he said finally. "But I wouldn't even know where to begin, where to go." "There's always somewhere," she said, her voice soft but steady. "A place where people don't look at you like you don't belong. You just have to be willing to find it." The words lingered in the air, settling into the quiet like the faint glow of the streetlights. Aki looked down at his hands, his fingers brushing lightly against the strap of his satchel. He didn't know if he believed her, but the thought of it, of somewhere better, felt like a faint spark of hope in the dark. The older Nico stood, brushing off her coat. "Think about it," she said, her voice gentle. "The city's not the only place for us." Before Aki could respond, she rose and turned away, her movements slow but deliberate. "See you around?" she said over her shoulder, her voice soft but firm, as if it carried a silent understanding. Her footsteps echoed faintly as she disappeared into the shadows of the alley. He sat there for a long time after she left, the chill of the night air settling into his bones. His mind lingered on her words, turning them over like a fragile piece of glass. For the first time in a long while, the weight in his chest felt a little lighter. The city was still vast and unkind, but the idea of something beyond it, something better, shimmered faintly at the edges of his thoughts, like it had done on many occasions before. But this time it felt slightly different, as if it had more potential somehow. As Aki stood to leave, he looked up at the sky, where a handful of stars peeked through the haze. The faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. Maybe there was somewhere else. Maybe one day he'd find it. Aki and the Bramblewick Café, Chapter 4. Whispers of a New Horizon. Early the next morning, sunlight still struggled to pierce through the seemingly constant grey haze that clung to the city. Aki stood by the small window in his apartment, his gaze fixed on the street below. The usual morning bustle was in full swing. Delivery trucks rumbling by, neighbours shouting to each other from open windows, the occasional bark of a dog. It was familiar, predictable, and yet Aki felt distant from it all, as though watching the scene unfold through a pane of frosted glass. The words of the older Neko girl from the night before echoed faintly in his mind. "The city's not the only place for us." He glanced around his apartment, the peeling wallpaper, the crooked shelf with his few belongings, the faint hum of the radiator struggling to warm the room. It was all he had ever known, yet the idea of leaving it behind stirred something slightly profound in him, something that he couldn't quite name. He thought of the cafe where he spent 7 days a week in what felt like an endless cycle of labour, abuse and exhaustion. He thought of the moments of kindness, the sweet girl, the occasional smiles from strangers. But they all felt so fleeting against the weight of everything else. The thoughts circling in his mind seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, and before long, the walls of his room began to feel too close, the air thick with the weight of it all. He needed to clear his head. He stepped outside onto the street for a breath of fresh air, the coolness of the morning brushing against his face. The courtyard from the night before caught his eye, and he found himself drawn to it again. This time, it was empty. The bench and bare tree cast in the soft glow of the morning light. Aki sat down, letting the quiet settle over him. His tail curled loosely at his side as he watched a pair of sparrows flutter down to peck at crumbs on the cobblestones. He thought of his mother's voice, a distant memory that rose unbidden. "You'll find your place someday, Aki." He hadn't thought of her words in years. Aki's fingers brushed against the strap of his satchel, and an idea began to take shape. Not fully formed, but there, fragile and persistent. Maybe he couldn't leave today or tomorrow or even next month, but he could at least start on making the idea more feasible. He could save what little he could spare from his wages, no matter how small the amount. He could listen more closely, keep his ears tuned for whispers of places beyond the city. He could dream of somewhere better, and maybe one day he could make it real. The sparrows took flight, their wings beating softly as they disappeared into the sky. Aki watched them go, his heart now feeling lighter than it had been in days. For the first time, The thought of leaving didn't feel quite so impossible. The days that followed carried the same rhythm as before: work, home, and the quiet spaces in between. But something within Aki had shifted. The idea of leaving the city was no longer just a fleeting thought, easily dismissed. It had taken root, faint but steady, growing with each passing day. Aki had always moved through life with quiet caution, his steps measured and deliberate. But now his gaze lingered on the world around him in a way it never had before. The hum of distant trains, the faded posters advertising places he'd never been, the glances of strangers who seemed to come from somewhere outside of the city. Each detail felt like a reminder that there was more to the world than the city he had always known. He paused one afternoon, his eyes drawn to the framed photograph that hung on the cafe's wall. It was old and slightly faded, showing a wide stretch of beach bordered by rolling dunes. The sand shimmered under a golden sky, and waves curled gently along the shore. Aki had seen it countless times before, but today it caught him in a different way. His mind wandered back to childhood, to the evenings when his mother would tell him stories of the sea. "You would have loved it there," she had told him, her voice soft and warm. "The air is so fresh, and the water stretches farther than you can imagine. Your father and I went there before you were born. Someday maybe we'll all go together." It had never happened, of course. Life in the city had kept them tethered, and after his parents were gone, the stories had faded into the background of his memory. But now, standing there in the quiet cafe, the image of the sea felt alive again. The thought of it stirred something inside him, an image of wide skies and the sound of waves, just as his mother had described. That evening, as he walked home, the image of the sea stayed with him, more vivid than it had been in years. The air, the waves, the vastness she had described felt almost close enough to touch, even though he knew it was far beyond the edges of his world. For the first time in a long while, he didn't push the thought away. It lingered, fragile but persistent, like a spark that refused to fade. The next day, Aki found himself paying closer attention to the people around him. At the cafe, he watched customers come and go, noticing the ones who seemed to carry something different. A sense of purpose, perhaps, or the quiet ease of belonging to a world beyond the city's relentless pace. Their conversations caught his ear, snippets of plans and places that hinted at lives far removed from his own. A regular, a kind older woman who always tipped generously, paused as she stood at the counter. She studied Aki for a moment, her expression softening. "You work so hard here, dear," she said, her voice gentle but tinged with something heavier. "Someone like you deserves to be somewhere you're truly appreciated." Aki blinked, surprised by the sincerity in her tone. "Thank you," he murmured, his ears twitching slightly. The woman smiled faintly, as if lost in a thought of her own. "Don't let this place take too much from you," she added softly. "We only get so much time, you know. Make sure you save a little of it for yourself." Her words lingered long after she had gone, sinking into the fragile hope that had begun to grow within him. As the weeks wore on, Aki started tucking away small amounts of money. Coins and bills slipped into an old envelope he kept hidden in the back of his closet. It wasn't much, but the small ritual gave him something to hold on to, a quiet sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. The city remained vast and unkind, its weight pressing down on him as always. But the thought of somewhere else, a place where the air smelled of salt and the sky stretched wide, lingered in his mind. It wasn't a plan, not yet, just an idea, faint but persistent, like the memory of a dream that refused to fade. For now, It was enough to keep him moving forward one cautious step at a time. Aki and the Bramblewick Café, Chapter 5. A lighthouse in the fog. The rain had started again by the time Aki left the cafe that evening, a light drizzle that softened the edges of the city's harshness. As he walked home, his eyes were drawn to the small second-hand bookshop he passed by every day. Tucked between a laundromat and an old-fashioned hardware store, it had always blended into the background of his routine. But tonight, the warm glow spilling from its windows seemed to catch his attention in a way it hadn't before. The shelves inside a maze of faded covers and forgotten words. Something about the bookshop felt different this time. It seemed inviting somehow, almost as if it were calling to him. Aki hesitated for a moment, then thought of the questions that had been turning over in his mind, the idea of leaving the city, of what might lie beyond its boundaries. Maybe, just maybe, he could find some inspiration, or even answers here. Before he could second-guess himself, he stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed softly, and the warm, dusty air of the shop enveloped him. Shelves lined every wall, crammed with books of all sizes and colours. The faint scent of tea lingered in the air, mingling with the smell of old paper. Behind the counter sat an older woman, her silver hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck. She glanced up as he entered, her sharp eyes softening and lighting up a little as they landed on Aki's big fluffy cat ears. "Oh, good evening," she said, her voice warm and inviting, her smile widening as her eyes settled on him with a gentle curiosity. Aki hesitated just inside the doorway, his tail curling slightly behind him. "Good evening," he replied softly. "Is it all right to have a look around?" "Of course, take your time," she said, gesturing toward the rows of shelves. "What a lovely surprise. Neko visitors are rare here, but you're very welcome. Feel free to browse as long as you like, and if there's anything I can help you with, just let me know." Her words, so sincere and kind, made Aki pause. It wasn't often that he was greeted with such open warmth, and for a moment he wasn't sure how to respond. "Thank you," he said finally, bowing his head slightly. He moved deeper into the shop. The rows of books seemed endless, their spines worn from years of handling. Aki let his fingers skim lightly over them, the texture of old paper and faded lettering grounding him in the quiet. Near the back of the shop, his eyes landed on a book with a familiar image, a lighthouse standing tall against a stormy sea. He picked it up carefully, the weight of it solid in his hands. The cover was faded, the corners slightly frayed, but the image stirred something inside him. He opened it to the first page, his eyes drawn to the simple, flowing prose of a story about a fisherman who had left the city for the coast. He didn't realize how much time had passed until the woman's voice broke the silence. "That one's been there for years, waiting for the right person to come along," she said gently, smiling kindly, stepping closer. "I wonder if that's you." Aki turned, his ears twitching slightly as he looked at her. "It's a beautiful story," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She studied him for a moment, her expression softening further. "You're welcome to stay and read it," she said. "I'm about to make another cup of tea. I can make one for you too, if you'd like." Aki hesitated, glancing down at the book in his hands. The warmth of the shop and the offer of tea felt unusually comforting, a stark contrast to the indifference he was so used to. His tail flicked lightly, betraying the quiet appeal of the invitation. "Are you sure? I don't want to—" "It's absolutely no problem," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "This shop is here to be used, not just admired. Come and have a seat at the table. It will make reading that heavy book easier." She led him to a small table near the shop counter. where a mismatched set of chairs sat tucked beneath it. Aki, looking grateful, placed the book carefully on the table, his tail curling neatly around the legs of the chair as he sat down. The woman returned moments later with 2 steaming mugs of tea, setting one in front of him. "I'm Marjorie," she said, taking the seat across from him. "Aki," he replied softly, his hands wrapping around the warmth of the mug. "Thank you. You're very kind." For a while they sat in companionable silence, Marjorie tending to cleaning a small pile of books in front of her on the table, as Aki became lost again in the pages of the book. Marjorie kept glancing at him with quiet curiosity. After some time, she spoke again. "Forgive me, but you have the look of someone with a goal in mind, like someone setting out on a research mission," she said. "I used to be a librarian, and research is my superpower." She chuckled quietly. "Is it something I can help you with, Aki?" Aki hesitated, lowering his gaze to the open book. The idea of sharing his thoughts with a stranger felt daunting, but Marjorie's voice carried a gentle sincerity that softened his hesitation. "I don't know if it's a goal," he said softly, his fingers brushing the edge of the page. "It's more of a thought, a dream, maybe." Marjorie set down the book she was cleaning and leaned forward slightly, her expression open and attentive. "Dreams are important," she said. "They give us something to hold on to even when the world feels heavy." Aki glanced up at her, his ears twitching slightly. "I've been thinking about leaving the city," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know where I'd go or how I'd even get there, but my mother used to tell me stories about the sea. I think I'd like to see it someday." Marjorie's gaze softened, and she offered him a small, encouraging smile. "The sea," she said thoughtfully. "There's something magical about it, isn't there? The way it stretches out forever, like a promise waiting to be kept." Aki nodded, the faintest flicker of a smile touching his lips. "She said the air smells different there, fresh and clean, and the sound of the waves. I've always imagined it must be peaceful." Marjorie rested her chin on her hand, her expression warm. "It sounds like a wonderful dream, Aki, and one certainly worth chasing." He looked down at the book again, his tail curling tighter around the chair leg. "I'm not sure if it's possible," he said quietly. "I barely make enough to get by as it is." "Well," Marjorie said, her voice steady but kind, "dreams don't have to happen all at once. Sometimes they're like puzzles. You gather the pieces little by little until they start to take shape." Aki blinked, her words sinking in like a gentle weight. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted. Marjorie straightened, her smile widening. "Well, you're in a great place to begin," she said. "This shop is full of stories and information, more than you'd think at first glance. If you're serious about exploring your dream, you're welcome to use it as much as you need. And if there's something specific you're looking for, I'll do my best to help you find it." Aki stared at her, his ears perking slightly in surprise. "You'd really do that for me?" "Of course," Marjorie replied, her tone light but earnest. "That's the beauty of books. They're full of knowledge and inspiration. Sometimes the right one can give you the answers you didn't even know you were looking for." The warmth in her voice made something in Aki's chest tighten, not in a painful way, but in a way that felt like light pressing against the edges of a darkened room. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. Marjorie picked up her tea, her eyes sparkling with something close to affection. "It's my pleasure, Aki," she said. "And for what it's worth, I believe in your dream. If anyone can find their way to the sea, I think it's you." They sat in silence for a while after that, the quiet of the shop settling around them like a soft blanket. Aki turned another page, but the words blurred as his thoughts drifted. He couldn't remember the last time someone had been so openly kind to him, without expectation or judgment. Marjorie's warmth was unlike anything he was used to, a gentle sincerity that felt almost fragile in its rarity. It stirred something deep within him, a mix of gratitude and disbelief, as though he had stumbled into a dream he didn't want to wake from. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Aki felt seen, not as a worker, not as a neko, but as a person with a dream worth nurturing. The weight of the city, so constant and suffocating, seemed to ease, leaving space for the fragile hope of his dream to grow. Over the following weeks, Aki's visits to the bookshop became a quiet ritual. Each evening after his shift, he found himself drawn to its warmth, the steady glow of its lights a small beacon in the sea of the city's indifference. Marjorie always greeted him with a welcoming smile, her wise eyes softening as he stepped through the door. She had started setting aside books for him, guides on small-town living, memoirs of people who had left bustling cities behind, and even practical texts on running a cafe. Aki read them eagerly, the words filling his heart with knowledge and sparking ideas for a life beyond the city. One evening, as the rain tapped lightly against the windows, Marjorie placed a mug of tea in front of Aki and settled into the chair across from him. He was engrossed in a book about a painter who had journeyed along the coast, his tail flicking slightly as he read. "Aki, you seem like someone who's carrying a lot," Marjorie said gently, her voice low and thoughtful. Aki hesitated, his ears flattening slightly as he looked down at the book in his lap. "I guess I am," he admitted softly, his voice barely above a whisper, though sometimes it feels like there isn't a way out. Marjorie studied him quietly for a moment, her eyes softening with compassion. "That can be a heavy burden to carry on your own," she said. "But sometimes sharing it can make it feel just a little lighter." Eki's tail curled around the leg of his chair, and for a moment he didn't respond. The silence stretched between them, but it was a gentle one, like the pause before a long-held breath is released. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "I've always lived in the city," he began. "My parents were neko too. They worked so hard, but it was never enough to make life easier. They always told me to keep my head down, to stay quiet, to avoid trouble." Marjorie nodded, her expression encouraging but unobtrusive, as though she knew he needed the space to find his words. "I started working when I was just a kid," Aki continued. "It's all I've ever known. First a bakery, then the cafe. They're just jobs, but it's hard to explain. Sometimes it feels like I'm invisible. Or worse, like I'm not even a person to some people." His voice faltered, and he swallowed hard, his hands tightening slightly on the edges of the book. "I've been called names, pushed around, beaten up. It's not just me. It's the same for most neko. People think they can do whatever they want because we're so small, because we're not strong and we can't fight back." Marjorie's hand twitched slightly, as though she wanted to reach out, but she stayed where she was, letting him speak. "I've learned to smile through it," Aki said, his voice quieter now. "To act like it doesn't hurt, but it does. It always does." The words lingered in the air, heavy but honest. Aki glanced up at Marjorie, half expecting to see pity in her expression. But there was none. Instead, her gaze was warm and steady, filled with something he hadn't expected. Respect. "I'm so sorry, Aki," she said softly, her voice steady but thick with emotion. The world can be so cruel, and you've had to endure more than anyone should. Aki's ears twitched, and he looked back down at the book. That's why I want to leave, he murmured. I want to find somewhere quiet, somewhere safe, somewhere I don't have to keep pretending everything's okay. Marjorie reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. That's not just a dream, Aki, she said firmly. It's something you can have. It won't be easy, but I can see it in you. You've got the strength to make it happen. Her words struck something deep inside him, a fragile spark of hope that he'd almost forgotten he could feel. Thank you, he said, his voice trembling slightly. Marjorie gave his hand a gentle squeeze before pulling back, her smile soft but resolute. And you're not alone in this. If there's anything I can do to help, you can count on me. This bookshop is filled with a wealth of knowledge and information, and it is your space, Aki. Use it to dream, to plan, whatever you need. For a while, they sat in silence. Aki glanced down at the open book on the table in front of him, his fingers brushing the worn edges of its pages. Marjorie's kindness was unlike anything he'd known. It wasn't just her words. It was the way she listened, the way she looked at him like he mattered. For the first time in a long while, the weight of the city felt just a little lighter, and the thought of his dream felt another small step closer to being real. Aki and the Bramblewick Café, Chapter 6. A witness to the chaos. The cafe was alive with its usual chaos, a cacophony of clinking mugs, raised voices, and the hiss of the espresso machine. Aki weaved through the crowd, his arms laden with a tray of drinks, his movements practiced and precise. The weight of the day already pressed heavily on him, but he kept his head down and his ears alert, navigating the relentless tide of impatient customers. As he placed a tray on a table near the window, a familiar voice broke through the noise. Well, if it isn't my favourite Neko. Aki froze, his ears flicking toward the sound. He turned to see Marjorie seated at a corner table, her warm smile standing in stark contrast to the chaotic scene around her. Marjorie? He said, his voice soft but tinged with surprise. I thought I'd stop by and see what keeps you so busy, she said, gesturing to the bustling cafe. I hope you don't mind. Aki's tail swayed nervously behind him. It's not the nicest place, he admitted, glancing around the crowded room. Marjorie waved a dismissive hand. Nonsense. It's busy, but I've seen worse. I'll take a cup of tea if you have time. With a quick nod, Aki retreated to the counter, a strange mix of pride and unease stirring within him. The bookshop had become a sanctuary for him, a place of quiet and understanding. Having Marjorie here, in the centre of his daily struggles, felt like two worlds colliding. When he returned with her tea, Marjorie thanked him warmly and settled into her seat, her sharp eyes quietly scanning the cafe. It didn't take long for her to notice the way people treated him. A group of office workers sat near the counter, their laughter loud and grating. One of them leaned back in his chair, smirking as Aki passed by. Hey, cat boy, he called out. Bet it's hard keeping your fur out of the drinks. You sure this place passed a health inspection? The others laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. Aki's ears flattened, but he nodded silently, collecting their empty mugs with careful precision, his tail curling tightly around his leg. Marjorie's smile faded, her hand tightening around her teacup. She watched as Aki delivered their drinks moments later, his every movement calm and controlled, even as their jeers continued. Careful there, Kitty, one of them said with a sneer, leaning closer as Aki set the mugs down. Wouldn't want any fur in our coffee. Or is that extra flavouring part of the service? Aki said nothing, retreating quickly to the counter as their laughter followed him. Marjorie's gaze hardened, but she remained silent, her sharp eyes never leaving Aki. Later, as Aki moved between tables, a middle-aged woman with a sharp voice and an impatient air rapped her knuckles against the table. "You there, cat boy!" she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "This coffee's lukewarm. Bring me another. Hot this time. And hurry. I have no time to wait." Aki stiffened at her tone but nodded, carefully taking the cup without a word. As he turned away, the woman scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain, loud enough for Marjorie to hear. "Honestly, I don't know why they let them work here. They can't even manage a simple smile." Marjorie's lips pressed into a thin line, the light in her eyes dimming. She glanced at Aki as he passed by her table again, his shoulders slightly hunched, but his face carefully neutral. "Aki," Marjorie said gently, reaching out to touch his arm as he passed. He stopped immediately, his tail curling nervously around his leg. His ears flicked as he turned to face her, concern and warmth in his eyes. "Marjorie, is everything all right?" he asked softly. "Sit with me for a moment," she said, her voice calm but insistent. "I don't know if I can," he murmured, his fingers tightening on the edge of his apron. "The manager—" "Just for a moment," Marjorie interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument, but filled with a quiet kindness. After a pause, Aki nodded and slid into the chair across from her, his hands resting uncertainly in his lap. Marjorie leaned forward slightly, her eyes soft but resolute. "Aki," she began, her voice steady but warm, "you don't deserve this. None of it." His ears twitched, his gaze dropping to the table. "I'm just doing my job," he said quietly. "You're doing far more than that," Marjorie said firmly. "And they don't see it. They don't see you. But I do." Aki's breath caught, his hands curling slightly in his lap. He looked up, meeting her gaze, and the sincerity in her expression struck something deep inside him. "You're worth so much more than this," Marjorie continued, her voice softening but losing none of its conviction. "I need you to know that. I need you to believe it, Aki." For a long moment he didn't say anything, the weight of her words settling over him like a gentle hand on his heart. "Thank you," he whispered finally, his voice trembling slightly. Before Marjorie could reply, the manager's sharp voice called out his name from across the cafe. Aki flinched, glancing toward the counter. "I have to go," he said softly, rising from the chair. Marjorie nodded, her gaze never leaving his. "Go on then," she said gently. "But remember what I said. You're worth more than this, Aki. Don't let them make you forget it." He offered her the faintest smile, his tail swaying lightly behind him as he turned and hurried back to work. Marjorie sat back in her chair, watching him go, her heart aching for the boy who carried so much more than he should have. As he returned to work, Marjorie remained at her table, watching the ebb and flow of the cafe with a quiet intensity. She had seen enough to understand that Aki's days here were far harder than he had ever let on. When she finally stood to leave, she caught his eye across the room and gave him a small, reassuring smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that someone saw him, not as a worker or a Nico, but as a person worthy of kindness and respect. Aki and the Bramblewick Café, Chapter 7. Dreams Worth Fighting For. Marjorie couldn't shake the images from her mind. The way Aki's ears had flattened when the customers mocked him. The careful, measured way he had moved, trying to avoid provoking more cruelty. The quiet resignation in his eyes as he endured what no one should have to. She sat in the bookshop that afternoon, a stack of books in front of her, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The rain pattered against the windows, a soft rhythm that usually brought her comfort, but tonight it felt like a distant murmur. She had always sensed that Aki carried more than he let on. His quiet demeanour and the way he seemed to shrink into himself when he spoke of the city told her as much. But seeing it with her own eyes had stirred something in her, a mix of deep sadness and indignation that refused to be ignored. Marjorie set the book she had been holding aside, her hands lingering on the worn edges of the table. Aki deserved better. That much she knew. As the thought settled over her, she glanced toward the back of the shop, where a small, dusty writing desk sat unused beneath a shelf of weathered books. The desk had been a quiet fixture for years, its dark wood polished smooth by time. She rose from her stool, moving toward it with purpose. Sliding open the drawer, she pulled out a stack of faded stationery and a fountain pen, its brass finish worn but functional. Her fingers brushed over the edges of the paper, pausing for a moment as if weighing the importance of the words she was about to commit to the page. She began to write. That evening, Aki arrived at the bookshop as usual, his expression weary but softening as he stepped into the familiar warmth of the space. "Evening, Aki," Marjorie said, her voice steady but warm. She gestured to the teapot already waiting on the counter. "Go sit down. I'll bring the tea over." Aki hesitated, his ears twitching slightly. "Are you sure? I can—" "Sit," she said firmly, though her tone held no sharpness. He obeyed, settling into his usual spot by the window as she poured 2 cups of tea. When she joined him, her sharp eyes studied him for a moment before she spoke. "How do you do it, Aki?" she asked softly. "Do what?" he replied, his tail curling slightly around the leg of the chair. "Carry all of that," Marjorie said, gesturing faintly as if the weight he bore were something visible. "The way they treat you. The way the world seems to look right through you. How do you keep going?" Aki blinked, his ears flattening slightly as he glanced down at the table. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "I guess. I've just got used to it. You have to survive." Marjorie's hands tightened slightly around her mug, but she kept her voice steady. "You shouldn't have to survive like that," she said. "No one should." Aki didn't reply, his gaze fixed on the table. After a moment, Marjorie leaned forward, her voice softening. "Aki," she said gently, "I've been thinking. If you want to leave the city someday, you'll need more than just a dream. You'll need a plan." He glanced up at her, his expression wary but curious. "I have an old friend who runs a little cafe by the coast. She's mentioned in the past how hard it can be to find good help in a small town, so I wrote to her. I asked if she might have room for someone like you, someone hard-working and reliable." Aki's ears flicked, his big eyes widening. You wrote to her? About me?" he asked softly, his voice tinged with disbelief. Marjorie nodded, a gentle smile touching her lips, though her eyes held a flicker of regret. "I did. I hope you don't mind. After seeing you today at the cafe, seeing how they treated you, it suddenly reminded me of my old friend who runs the little cafe by the coast. I'm sorry I didn't think of her sooner, but as soon as the thought struck me, I couldn't wait. I sat down right away and wrote to her. I just had to try." Aki stared at her, his ears twitching slightly as her words sank in. His hands tightened on the edge of the counter, the emotions swirling within him almost too much to name. "You really did that for me," he whispered, his voice trembling just enough to betray the depth of his feelings. Marjorie's smile softened, her steady gaze grounding him. "I did. But Aki, this is just a question, a possibility. I don't know yet if she'll even have room for you or if it's the right fit. All I can do is ask." He nodded, swallowing hard, but the knot in his chest didn't ease. Even so. He paused, his tail curling tightly around his leg. Even if it doesn't lead anywhere. Thank you for thinking of me, for trying. Marjorie reached across the counter, her hand tenderly cupping his cheek. Her voice, thick with emotion, was barely above a whisper. You're worth trying for, Aki. Don't let anyone make you think you're not. Aki lowered his gaze, his cheeks warming. I don't know how to thank you, Marjorie, he murmured. By not giving up, Marjorie replied, her voice firm but kind. No matter what happens, you hold on to that dream of yours, all right? He nodded again, his big eyes shining with something close to hope. The rain was soft, a gentle mist that clung to Aki's coat and hair as he walked through the dimly lit streets toward home. His satchel bumped lightly against his side. For the first time in what felt like forever, Aki's steps felt lighter somehow, his usual cautious shuffle replaced with something almost deliberate. The city around him was still vast and unkind, the usual shadows of its alleys looming in the corners of his vision, but tonight they didn't seem as heavy. Marjorie's words echoed in his mind, warm and steady, like the flicker of a candle in a darkened room. You're worth trying for. Aki tilted his head back, letting the drizzle cool his flushed face. His ears twitched at the soft patter of rain against the rooftops, and for a fleeting moment he wondered how the rain might mingle with the crashing of waves by the coast, a sound he had never heard, but could almost picture. The streets stretched on, familiar but no longer quite so oppressive. A small, cautious hope had gathered in his chest, a feeling he hadn't dared to hold on to for so long. He didn't know what the future held or if Marjorie's letter would lead anywhere, but the thought of someone caring enough to try, that alone made the night feel brighter, even beneath the rain-soaked sky. Aki and the Bramblewick Café, Chapter 8. A Day to Forget. The cafe was busier than ever, a relentless tide of noise and activity that left Aki struggling to keep up. The manager's sharp voice cut through the din like a blade. Aki! Table 6 has been waiting for 10 minutes. What are you doing? Stop dragging your feet! I'm sorry, Aki mumbled, grabbing the tray of steaming coffees and weaving through the crowded room. Table 6 was loud, the group of 4 young men leaning back in their chairs, their conversation littered with sharp bursts of laughter. As Aki approached with their drinks, balancing the tray effortlessly, one of them noticed him and smirked. Hey, look, he said, his voice just loud enough to make sure Aki heard. The cat's back with our drinks, his friend chuckled, leaning forward. Bet he'd drop it if we tossed him a ball of yarn. The rest of the group laughed loudly. Aki's ears flattened slightly, but he kept his expression neutral as he began setting their drinks down. Another man, tapping his fingers against the table, added with a mocking grin, You know cats hate dogs, right? Lucky none of us brought one. Aki's hands tightened on the tray, but eyes focused on the table, as if he hadn't heard them. Just as Aki started to walk away, one of the men leaned closer and gave a low, exaggerated growl, followed by dog barking noises that had the group in stitches of laughter. The barking continued, even turning into wolf howling. Aki continued to walk away with his tray, his footsteps light but deliberate. The laughter, barking and howling noises trailed behind him, sharp and grating in the otherwise bustling cafe. He kept his ears upright, his tail swaying slightly, though every instinct told him to drop them low, to curl in on himself. There had been a time years ago when mockery like this might have made him laugh nervously or even try to joke along, desperate to smooth over the moment and prove he could take it. Back then, it had felt like the only way to survive, play the part, be the good-natured, cute Nico, and maybe they'd let it go. But years of the same taunts, the same jokes, had stripped away any humour he might have once found in it. What started as mild embarrassment had turned into something heavier, more insidious, a quiet ache that settled in his chest every time he walked away from moments like these. The jokes were always the same, as if the humans thought they were being original, clever. They weren't. And maybe that's what stung the most. The utter thoughtlessness of it, the way they made him feel small and ridiculous without even trying. As he reached the counter, he set the tray down, his hands trembling faintly. He exhaled a slow, measured breath, trying to will the knot in his stomach to loosen. Aki had learned long ago that reacting would only make it worse. Laughter could quickly turn to something uglier, something harsher, and so he endured, because that's what Nekos did. But enduring didn't mean it didn't hurt. It didn't mean it didn't wear him down little by little, until even the smallest of jeers felt like a chain wrapped tightly around his heart, dragging him down. He stole a glance back at the table. They'd already moved on, their laughter now directed at one another, the earlier mockery forgotten as easily as it had been delivered. But for Aki, the moment lingered, the echoes of their barking following him long after the sound had died away. A short while later, Aki was tending to another table, carefully balancing a tray of drinks as he manoeuvred through the crowded cafe. The young men at table 6 were still there, their voices carrying above the din. "Hey, Catboy!" one of them called, but Aki kept his head down, pretending not to hear. As he passed their table, one of the men stretched out his leg, sticking his foot directly in Aki's path. Aki didn't see it until it was too late. His ankle caught on the man's shoe, and he stumbled forward, the tray tilting precariously. The drinks tumbled to the floor in a cacophony of shattering glass and splashing coffee. Aki landed hard on his hands and knees, the hot liquid soaking through his uniform and burning his skin. The group burst into laughter, their jeers echoing through the stunned silence of the cafe. "Careful there, Kitty," one of them said, his grin wide and malicious. "Guess you really do need a tail to keep your balance." Aki's hands trembled as he tried to gather the shattered pieces, his tail curling tightly around his leg, his ears flattened against his head, his chest tightening with humiliation and pain. The manager's voice broke through the chaos, sharp and cutting. "What on earth is going on here?" She stormed over, her face a mask of fury. I'm sorry," Aki stammered, his voice barely audible. The young men watched with smug expressions, one of them leaning back in his chair. "You're lucky we didn't get burned, Catboy," he said. "Might have had to charge you for damages." Aki's throat tightened, but he didn't respond. He kept his head down, his hands shaking as he worked to clean up the mess. As he reached for the last piece of broken glass, a sharp tug on his tail made him freeze. Pain shot up his spine, and he yelped, stumbling forward. The group erupted into laughter again, their mockery ringing in Aki's ears. By the time the group of young men left, Aki's hands were still trembling, the sting of humiliation lingering like a heavy weight in his chest. He kept his head down, methodically clearing tables, his movements mechanical as though trying to detach himself from the whispers and stares of the remaining customers. Each shattered glass and spilled coffee stain felt like a mark against him, a reminder of his place in this world, small, fragile and unnoticed, unless he was being mocked. The cafe began to quiet down, the late afternoon lull settling in as customers trickled out. Aki took a deep breath, hoping for even a moment's reprieve. The bell above the door chimed again, and a cluster of young women entered, their bright laughter filling the space. They were dressed in fashionable coats and scarves, their hair neatly styled. Aki glanced up briefly before turning his attention back to the counter, where the manager was busy flipping through receipts. The girls chose a table near the window, their voices carrying as they chatted and giggled. Aki's stomach tightened. It was his job to approach them. "Good afternoon," he said softly. "What can I get for you?" The girls paused their conversation, their eyes flicking toward him. For a moment there was silence as they exchanged glances. I'll have a latte," one of them said finally, her voice tinged with hesitation. "Make that 2, another added, her tone more clipped. "And a hot chocolate for me," a third chimed in, not bothering to look at Aki as she scrolled through her phone. Aki nodded quickly, jotting down their order. "I'll bring those right over," he said, turning to leave. When he returned a few minutes later, balancing the drinks carefully on a tray, the girls' conversation had resumed, their laughter lilting and bright. He set each cup down with practiced care, his ears twitching slightly at the sound of their voices. "Here you go," he said softly, stepping back once he'd finished. "Thanks," one of them said curtly, not looking up. As Aki turned to leave, their voices dropped, and though they weren't speaking directly to him, he caught every word. "Did you see his tail?" one of them whispered, her tone laced with disdain. "Reminds me of a rat." "And those ears," another chimed in, barely suppressing a giggle. "I bet he's as filthy as one too." Aki froze mid-step, his tail curling defensively around his leg. His ears flattened, and he tried to quicken his pace, but the sound of their laughter followed him all the way back to the counter. Behind the counter, the manager glanced up from her receipts, her eyes narrowing. "You're not slacking again, are you?" she asked sharply, her tone leaving no room for argument. "No, ma'am," Aki mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl's distant mockery continued, interspersed with whispers and giggles that made Aki's skin crawl. He kept his head down, wiping the counter with shaking hands, trying to block out their voices. But the words echoed in his mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. By the time they left, their drinks only half finished, Aki felt like he was barely holding himself together. For the rest of his shift, he avoided looking at the other customers, afraid of what he might see in their expressions. Pity, amusement, or worse, indifference. The bell above the second-hand bookshop door chimed softly as Aki stepped inside, the familiar sound briefly soothing the raw edges of his nerves. The warm, slightly musty scent of old books greeted him, a sharp contrast to the harsh coffee and spilled drinks that clung to his uniform. Marjorie glanced up from the counter, a smile starting to form on her face, but it faltered the moment she saw him. His stained clothes, hunched shoulders, flattened ears, glazed eyes, and the way his tail barely moved told her everything she needed to know. "Aki," she said gently, coming around the counter. "Oh, sweetheart, sit down. I'll put the kettle on." He hesitated, his hands clenching and unclenching, as if unsure of what to do. "I'm okay," he mumbled, but his voice wavered, betraying him. "Clearly you're not," Marjorie said firmly but kindly, guiding him toward the small table near the corner. "And that's okay. You're safe here. Sit, and I'll bring you some tea." Aki sank into the chair, his tail curling tightly around the legs. He stared down at his hands, the trembling barely noticeable now, but still there. The warmth of the shop wrapped around him, but it couldn't quite reach the ache in his chest. Marjorie returned a few moments later with 2 steaming mugs, setting one in front of him before sitting across the table. She didn't speak right away, letting the quiet settle between them. When Aki finally looked up, his eyes were holding back tears, his voice soft. "It was a bad day," he admitted. "I can see that," Marjorie said gently, her hands wrapped around her mug. "Want to tell me what happened?" Aki hesitated, his ears twitching slightly. "It's nothing new," he said after a moment. "Just people being people." Marjorie's eyes softened, her gaze steady but kind. "Sometimes it helps to say it out loud," she said quietly. For a moment, Aki stayed silent, his hands tightening around the mug. Then the words began to spill out, halting at first but gathering momentum as he spoke. He told her about the young men, their jeers, and the deliberate trip that sent him crashing to the ground. He told her about the sharp pain of his tail being yanked, the humiliation that burned brighter than the spilled coffee. And then he told her about the girls, their whispered mockery cutting through what little resolve he had left. Marjorie listened, her expression unchanging but her hands tightening slightly on the mug. When he finished, he looked down, his ears flattening. I don't understand why they do it," he whispered. "I don't even know them. And they hate me." "They don't hate you," Marjorie said softly. "They don't even know you. That kind of cruelty comes from ignorance, Aki. It's not about you, it's about them." "It doesn't feel that way," he murmured. "It feels like I don't matter, like I'm not even a real person to them." Marjorie reached across the table, her hand resting reassuringly over his. "You matter," she said firmly, "more than you know. And their actions say more about who they are than who you are." Aki blinked, his vision blurring slightly as tears welled up. "I try so hard," he whispered, "to stay quiet, to not cause trouble. But it's never enough. They always find something." "That's because they're looking for something," Marjorie said, her tone steady but filled with quiet anger. "They're looking for a reason to feel bigger by making someone else feel smaller. And that's not your fault, Aki. It's theirs." Her words settled over him, a quiet warmth pushing back against the cold weight in his chest. Aki blinked back, the tears threatening to spill, and whispered, "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. It's too much." Marjorie's heart clenched at the sight of him. She leaned forward, her eyes soft with concern. "Aki," she said gently, her hand covering his, "it's all right to feel that way. After everything you've been through, anyone would." His tail twitched slightly, curling tighter around his leg. I can't see a way out," he murmured. "It's like I'm trapped, and no matter what I do, it's never enough." Marjorie let out a slow breath, her grip on his hand tightening slightly. "I know it feels like that right now," she said, her tone calm but steady. "And it's not fair that it's all fallen on you. But I need you to trust me on this, Aki. There is hope, even if it doesn't feel that way right now." He glanced up at her then, his wide eyes tinged with a mixture of doubt and longing. "What hope?" Marjorie straightened, her expression softening, but her voice firm. "The letter I sent to my friend. I haven't received her reply yet, but if there's an opening at her cafe, I know she'll consider you. And if it doesn't work out, we'll figure out another way." Aki's ears twitched slightly, his voice trembling. "But what if it's a no? What if I just keep ending up here, stuck like this?" Marjorie shook her head, her hand moving to rest gently on his cheek. "Then we'll keep trying. I know it's hard to see now, but you're not stuck, Aki. You're stronger than you think, and you have more options than the city wants you to believe." He stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in slowly. "You really think there's a chance?" "I do," she said, her voice unwavering. "I wouldn't have written to her if I didn't. And Aki, even if it's not this cafe, even if it takes a little longer to find your way out, I promise I will help you. You're not in this alone." The emotion in her tone was enough to ease the tight knot in his chest just a little. He lowered his gaze, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Marjorie. I mean it. You're an amazing person." Her smile was warm but resolute. "Don't thank me yet, Aki," she said lightly. "Just promise me you won't give up on yourself. Not now. Not ever." Aki nodded slowly, the faintest flicker of hope stirring in the depths of his heart. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that maybe, just maybe, things could change. Aki and the Bramblewick Café, Chapter 9. A Glimpse Beyond the City. The bookshop was quiet the next morning, the air filled with the soft rustle of pages and the faint creak of wooden shelves. Marjorie sat at her desk near the window, a steaming cup of tea at her side as she sorted through a small stack of mail. Her fingers paused when she saw the familiar handwriting on one of the envelopes. It was from her friend at the coast. She set the other letters aside carefully, her heart beating just a little faster. With deliberate movements, she broke the seal and unfolded the neatly written letter inside. "Dear Marjorie, it's been far too long since I last heard from you, and it was such a lovely surprise to receive your letter. I hope this reply finds you well. As for the matter you wrote about, I can't deny it piqued my interest. Your description of this young man tugged at my heart. He sounds like someone truly special, and I trust your judgment completely. The truth is, we could use another set of hands at the cafe. Business has picked up lately, and I've been thinking about hiring someone, though I hadn't quite started looking yet. But before we make any decisions, I'd like to meet him. If he's as kind and hard-working as you say, I'm sure we could find a place for him here. Let me know if this sounds like a good next step, and we can arrange a time for him to visit. Until then, take care, my dear friend. Warmest regards, Isabel." Marjorie exhaled slowly, a smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't a definitive yes, but it was far from a no. She set the letter down carefully, her mind already turning over how to share the news with Aki. She wanted to tell him right away, to see the hope light up in his eyes, but she also knew how fragile that hope could be. If he interpreted this as a guarantee and things didn't work out, the disappointment would be crushing. For now, she tucked the letter into a drawer and returned to her tasks, deciding to wait until Aki's next visit to broach the subject. The bell above the shop door chimed softly as Aki stepped inside, the gentle warmth of the shop embracing him. Marjorie looked up from her place behind the counter, her smile brightening at the sight of him. "Evening, Aki," she said, pouring tea into 2 mismatched mugs. "You're just in time. I've just made a fresh pot." Aki smiled faintly, his ears twitching slightly as he set his satchel down by the table. "Perfect timing," he said softly, accepting the mug she offered. Marjorie watched him as he took a seat, his movements less heavy than they'd been the night before. "How are you feeling today?" she asked, her tone gentle but curious. Aki paused, the steam from the tea curling around his face as he held the mug close. "A little better," he said after a moment, his voice steady but quiet. "Yesterday was really hard, but today it wasn't quite so bad." His tail flicked lightly against the chair leg, a subtle sign of his improved mood. Marjorie's smile widened, relief softening her features. "I'm so glad to hear that," she said warmly. "You've been on my mind all day." Aki blinked, his ears twitching slightly as he looked up at her. "Really?" he asked, his voice quiet with a mix of surprise and shyness. Marjorie nodded, her expression earnest. "Of course, I was worried about you after yesterday." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the soft clink of Marjorie's spoon stirring her tea filling the space. Marjorie set her mug down and leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering as her expression grew more intent. "Aki," she began carefully, "I heard back from my friend today." His ears perked slightly, his tail flicking once before curling around his leg. "You did?" "I did," Marjorie said, her tone calm and measured. "She's interested, but she'd like to meet you first before making any decisions." Aki's hands tightened around the mug, his expression flickering between hope and apprehension. She wants to meet me?" Marjorie nodded, her gaze steady. "She runs a small cafe by the coast. Nothing fancy, but she's a good person, someone who values kindness and hard work. I think you'd really like her." Aki looked down at his tea, his ears twitching slightly. "What if I mess it up?" he whispered. "You won't," Marjorie said firmly. "Just be yourself, Aki. That's all you need to do." He hesitated, his voice trembling slightly. What if that's not enough? Marjorie reached across the table, her hand resting lightly over his. "It will be," she said gently. "Trust me on this. You're more than enough." She smiled gently, watching the emotions flicker across Aki's face as he processed the idea of meeting her friend. She waited a moment before continuing, her voice soft and encouraging. "The cafe is in a little coastal town called Bramblewick," she said, her tone brightening slightly. "It's small, quiet, right on the sea." Aki's ears twitched, the name tugging at his memory. "Bramblewick," he murmured, his brow furrowing. "I've seen pictures of it." "You have?" Marjorie asked, tilting her head curiously. He nodded slowly. "In one of the books I read here. It was an old travel guide. There was a picture of a harbour with boats tied up and hills behind them. It looked peaceful." Marjorie's smile widened. "That's the one? It hasn't changed much. It's the kind of place where time seems to move slower." The thought stirred something deep within Aki. He could almost picture it, the gentle lapping of waves, the call of seagulls, and the scent of salt in the air. It was a stark contrast to the oppressive noise and grime of the city. "But," he began hesitantly, his tail curling slightly, "how would I even get there? I've never been out of the city before. And wouldn't it be expensive?" Marjorie's expression softened, and she reached into the pocket of her cardigan, pulling out a small envelope. She placed it on the table between them, her eyes warm. "Aki," she said gently, "I was going to wait until the right moment, but I think this is as good a time as any. I bought you a train ticket." His ears perked up, his wide eyes darting to the envelope. You did?" "It's an open ticket," she explained. "You can use it whenever you're ready, so you don't have to rush or worry about schedules. It's only 2 hours away, so you could do it in a day, go there in the morning and be back home by evening. I know the thought of travelling might be daunting, but you can do this, Aki. It's just one step, and I'll help you with everything you need." Aki stared at the envelope, his emotions swirling in a mix of gratitude and apprehension. His hands trembled as he reached for it, his voice breaking. "Marjorie, Tears blurred his vision, and he blinked rapidly, his tail curling tighter around the chair leg. "I don't know what to say," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Thank you so much. No one's ever done anything like this for me." Marjorie's expression softened even further, and she reached across the table to gently touch his hand. "You don't need to thank me, Aki. This is what friends do for each other." His chest tightened at her words, the warmth of her kindness overwhelming. He clutched the envelope to his chest, his ears flattening slightly as he tried to regain his composure. "I don't deserve this," he murmured. "You do," Marjorie said firmly, her voice steady. "You deserve so much more than what this city has given you." Aki nodded, swallowing hard. I'll do my best," he said softly. "I'll try." "That's all anyone can ask," Marjorie said, smiling gently. "And no matter what happens, I'll be here to help you." The quiet resolve in her words steadied him, and for the first time in what felt like days, Aki allowed himself a small, tearful smile. For a while they sat in silence, the warmth of the shop settling around them. Aki cradled his tea, letting the stillness soothe the lingering tension in his chest. The envelope felt heavy in his satchel, not from the weight of the paper, but with the significance of what it represented. His gaze drifted toward the window, where the rain streaked in thin, glistening trails against the glass. Outside, the city buzzed faintly with its usual chaos, but here in the bookshop, everything felt calm, safe. "Have you really never been to the sea?" Marjorie asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Aki hesitated, his ears flicking slightly. "Not in person," he admitted, "but I've read about it, seen it in pictures." Marjorie smiled, resting her chin on her hand. "There's something about the sea. It makes you feel small in the best way. Like all the noise and stress of the world doesn't matter when you're standing in front of it." Aki's tail curled tightly around his leg as he absorbed her words. The thought of seeing the sea, of hearing the waves and smelling the salt air, stirred a quiet yearning inside him. It was something he'd only ever imagined, a distant dream he hadn't dared to hope for. Marjorie's voice softened. "You deserve to see it, Aki, to have that peace." He looked down at his tea, his fingers tightening slightly around the mug. "What if I go and it doesn't work out?" "Then you come back here and we'll figure something else out," Marjorie said simply. "This shop will always be your haven no matter what happens." The steadiness in her voice eased some of his fear. Aki nodded slowly, his heart trembling with a fragile kind of hope. "Thank you," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. Marjorie smiled warmly. "You don't need to thank me, Aki. You've already earned this chance." As the evening wore on, they spoke quietly about Bramblewick, about the train ride, and about the little cafe by the harbour. Aki didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was stepping towards something brighter. When he finally left the shop that night, the rain had eased into a soft drizzle. He clutched his satchel tightly, the envelope inside like a quiet promise against his chest. The city around him felt just a little less heavy, and in the back of his mind, the distant sound of waves began to take shape. Aki and the Bramblewick Café, Chapter 10. A Small Victory. The afternoon rush had passed, leaving the cafe in an uneasy calm. Aki wiped down tables with mechanical precision, his mind racing as he rehearsed what he was about to say. The train ticket tucked away in his satchel felt like both a lifeline and a weight, its presence lingering in his thoughts as the magnitude of his decision made his tail curl nervously. His manager stood behind the counter, tapping impatiently at the till, her expression as sharp and unyielding as ever. Aki approached carefully, his ears flattened slightly. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the coffee machine. She glanced at him, already frowning. "What is it now?" Aki hesitated, clutching the rag in his hand. I need to ask for a day off next week," he said, forcing the words out quickly before his courage faltered. The manager raised an eyebrow, her lips pressing into a thin line. "A day off?" she repeated, her tone cold. "And who exactly do you think will cover for you, We're short-staffed as it is." "It's just one day," Aki said, his voice trembling slightly. "I'll come in early the day before, or stay late the next day. I'll make it up however you need." She scoffed. "Which day are you even asking for?" "Wednesday," he replied quickly, his ears twitching. "I thought Since it's usually quieter in the middle of the week, it wouldn't— That's not for you to decide, she snapped, cutting him off. You don't get to dictate when you work. If that's a problem, maybe you should think about whether this job is right for you. The words stung, cutting deep into his already fragile confidence. For a moment, Aki felt his usual instinct to lower his head, to apologize, to retreat. His tail curled tightly around his leg, a reflex born from years of enduring and enduring. But then a thought struck him. If he retreated now, what would change? How many more days would he spend silently enduring words like these, shrinking into the shadows to avoid conflict, only to feel smaller with every passing day? The memory of Marjorie's unwavering faith in him flickered in his mind, her voice gentle but firm, as she'd told him he was worth so much more than this. He thought of the train ticket waiting in his satchel, a chance, maybe his only chance, to leave this place behind and find something better. His chest tightened as the weight of it all settled over him. He had to do this, for himself, for the dream he'd kept buried for so long. Aki straightened slightly, his tail flicking behind him as he steadied his breath. I have to take the day off, he said quietly, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. Even if it costs me this job. The manager's eyes widened slightly, caught off guard by his calm defiance. Excuse me? She said, her tone laced with disbelief. I've given everything I can here, Aki continued, his voice barely above a whisper but firm. I work hard. I take the worst shifts. I don't complain even when— He stopped, his throat tightening. Even when things aren't fair. The manager stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a long tense moment she said nothing. Finally she sighed, waving a hand dismissively. Fine. Take your day, she muttered, her tone grudging. But don't make a habit of this. Aki nodded, the tension in his chest easing slightly. Thank you, he said softly, turning away before she could say anything more. As he returned to clearing tables, his hands trembled slightly, but his heart felt lighter. It wasn't a victory, not really. He knew the cafe wouldn't change, and his manager's brief concession wasn't a sign of understanding. But it was enough to take that first step toward something better. The bookshop bell chimed softly as Aki stepped inside, the cool air of the evening swirling around him. Marjorie glanced up from behind the counter, her smile brightening as she saw him. Evening, Aki, she said warmly. You're just in time. I've just brewed a fresh pot of tea. Aki managed a small smile, his ears twitching as he shrugged off his coat. Thank you, he said softly, setting his satchel down by the table. I managed to get Wednesday off. Marjorie paused mid-pour, her face lighting up. That's wonderful, she said, placing the teapot down and turning toward him. I was hoping you'd be able to manage it. How did it go? Aki hesitated, his tail curling slightly. It wasn't easy, he admitted, sitting down at the small table. But I did it. I told her I needed the day and she wasn't happy, but she agreed. Marjorie's smile softened with pride. Good for you, Aki. That's not an easy thing to do. He nodded slightly, his hands curling around the warm mug she placed in front of him. What happens now? Marjorie pulled a chair closer and sat down across from him. Now, she said thoughtfully, I'll give my friend a call. She included her phone number in her reply letter, and I think it's time we make arrangements for you two to meet. Aki's ears perked slightly, though his tail flicked nervously. You're going to call her now? Marjorie nodded, her voice calm, but her eyes betraying a flicker of tension. I think it's the right time, if you're all right with it, she said gently, I'll let her know you've secured Wednesday off. Let's hope she's available then." She crossed her fingers, the gesture small but telling, as if willing the universe to align. Aki hesitated, his gaze lingering on his tea as the weight of it all settled over him. The thought of Marjorie speaking to her friend made everything feel startlingly real. This wasn't just a distant hope anymore, but the first step toward something that could change his life. His chest tightened, a mix of nerves and cautious anticipation swirling inside him. After a long moment, he nodded softly. "I guess this is really happening," he murmured. "All right, let's do it." Marjorie smiled, resting a reassuring hand on his for a brief moment before standing and heading back to the counter. Aki watched nervously as she picked up the phone, her movements steady and purposeful. She dialed the number, her expression calm but focused. Aki sat quietly, his ears twitching as the sound of the phone ringing echoed faintly through the shop. "Hello, my dear," Marjorie said warmly as the call connected. "It's Marjorie. Yes, it's been far too long. I'm so glad to hear your voice." Aki could only hear Marjorie's side of the conversation, her tone bright and reassuring as she spoke. "Yes, it's about the young man I mentioned in my letter, Aki. He managed to get next Wednesday off, and I was wondering if you might be available to meet him then." There was a pause as Marjorie listened to the reply, her expression softening. "Oh, that's wonderful. I'll make sure he has all the details." She glanced over at Aki, offering him a reassuring smile before returning her attention to the call. "Yes, I think you'll find him as lovely as I do. Thank you so much, my dear. I'll let him know." After a few more pleasantries, Marjorie hung up the phone and turned back to Aki, her smiling expression soft with quiet triumph. "It's all set," she said gently. "She's looking forward to meeting you on Wednesday." Aki's breath hitched, his heart racing as his tail curled tightly around the leg of his chair. "She is?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Marjorie nodded, her smile warm and reassuring. "She's eager to meet you, Aki. I told her how hard-working and kind you are. She said you sound like exactly the kind of person she'd want to have." Aki hesitated, his fingers brushing the edge of his teacup. "Marjorie, does she know what I am?" he asked softly, his ears flattening slightly. Marjorie's smile softened, her hand resting gently against his cheek. "Oh, sweetheart, you don't have to worry about things like that," she said firmly. "She knows, Aki, and it doesn't matter to her. Not your ears, not your tail. What matters to her is that you are a good person, one who cares, and you, Aki, fit that criteria better than anyone I've ever known." Aki stared at her, a faint tremor in his chest easing at her words. "You're sure?" Marjorie gently stroked her thumb down his cheek, her gaze unwavering. "Absolutely," she said. "Trust me, Aki. This could be the start of something wonderful." The weight of her words settled over him, quiet but powerful, like a hand reaching through the dark. As he looked down, his thoughts still swirled with hope and fear, but for the first time in a long while, the hope felt just a little stronger, like a light flickering to life in the shadows. Aki and the Bramblewick Café, Chapter 11. The Harbour's Rest Café. The morning light streamed into the bookshop as Aki stepped through the door, his satchel neatly slung over his shoulder. It was Wednesday, the day of his long-awaited journey, and Marjorie, arranging a display of books near the counter, looked up with delight as she saw him. "Oh, my goodness, Aki!" she exclaimed, pressing a hand to her chest. "You look absolutely adorable." Aki's ears flattened slightly, his cheeks flushing a soft pink. "It's just my best shirt," he murmured, glancing down at himself. And I combed my hair and my tail. Marjorie bustled over to him, her eyes sparkling as she took him in. Just your best shirt. You've outdone yourself, my dear. And that tail, it's perfection, she beamed, brushing an invisible speck of lint from his sleeve. You'll knock them off their feet. You know that? Aki shifted nervously, his tail curling tightly behind him. I hope so, he said softly. I'm so nervous, Marjorie. What if I say the wrong thing? What if they don't like me? Marjorie placed her hands gently on his shoulders, her expression softening. Aki, listen to me. You are kind, hard-working, and one of the sweetest souls I've ever met. Just be yourself, and they'll see that. He nodded slowly, though the tension in his chest didn't entirely ease. Oh, before you go, Marjorie said, bustling back to the counter. She picked up a small bag and handed it to him. I packed you a little lunch, just some treats to keep you going. Aki opened the bag hesitantly, peeking inside to find a neat little tub filled with sandwiches, fresh fruit, and a few small biscuits. His ears twitched, and his eyes shimmered as he looked up at her. Marjorie, thank you, he said, his voice trembling slightly. For everything. I don't know how to thank you properly. You don't need to, she replied warmly, brushing a hand lightly over his shoulder. That's what friends are for. Now, go on. You've got a train to catch. Aki nodded, gripping the bag tightly as he turned to leave. I'll do my best, he said softly, glancing back at her. Marjorie beamed at him, her hands clasped in front of her. I know you will, Aki, and you'll make us both proud. The train station was busier than Aki had expected for a Wednesday morning. The hum of conversations mingled with the screech of brakes and the rhythmic announcements over the loudspeakers. Aki clutched the strap of his satchel tightly, his heart pounding as he took it all in. He had never been to the station before. The size of it, the press of people bustling about with purpose, made him feel small and out of place. His ears twitched nervously as he tried to find his bearings, glancing between the signs overhead and the ticket tucked safely in his hand. Platform 3, he murmured to himself, his tail curling tightly against his leg. Weaving carefully through the crowd, he made his way to the platform, his eyes scanning the numbers until he saw the bold 3 displayed on a sign. The train was already arriving, its sleek metal exterior gleaming under the pale morning light. The sight of it made his stomach churn. He had never travelled on a train before, and the sheer size of it, the unfamiliarity of the experience, felt overwhelming. Taking a deep breath, Aki tightened his grip on his satchel. Just one step at a time, he whispered to himself. As the train doors hissed open, Aki hesitated. A businessman brushed past him with a distracted look, and Aki flinched slightly, stepping to the side. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting someone to stop him, to question what he was doing there. No one did. Gathering his courage, he stepped onto the train, his heart racing as the doors slid shut behind him. The interior was quieter than he expected, the hum of the engine a low, soothing vibration. He found a seat by the window, carefully placing his satchel on the seat beside him before sitting down. As the train lurched forward, the city outside the window began to blur. The tall grey buildings gave way to rows of houses, and then, slowly, eventually, to open fields. Aki leaned his head against the glass, his ears twitching at the unfamiliar sounds around him. He pulled out the notepad Marjorie had given him, running his fingers over the neat handwriting. Underneath the directions, she had scrawled a small message. You can do this. I believe in you. A faint smile tugged at his lips as he traced the words with his finger. The steady rhythm of the train and the open countryside rolling past began to calm the knot of nerves in his chest. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Aki felt the faintest spark of something he hadn't dared hope for. Freedom. The train pulled into the small station with a soft screech, the brakes hissing as the engine came to a halt. Aki stood, gripping his satchel tightly. His legs felt unsteady, whether from the motion of the train or the weight of his nerves, he wasn't sure. The doors slid open with a quiet chime, and Aki stepped out onto the platform. The air hit him immediately, fresh and crisp, carrying the faint scent of salt and seaweed. It was unlike anything he had ever breathed in before, and it filled his chest with a strange, calming warmth. Bramblewick Station was quiet, its simple brick building painted in soft, pastel colours that looked faded by the sun. Aki glanced around, his ears twitching as he took in the surroundings. Beyond the station, a winding cobblestone road led into the heart of the small seaside town. He adjusted the strap of his satchel, taking a deep breath. Marjorie's notes were tucked safely inside, along with the little packed lunch she had made him. He pulled the notepad out, glancing over the directions she had written. "Straight down the road," he murmured to himself, his tail swaying slightly as he set off. The cobblestone path led him past rows of charming cottages, with flower boxes brimming with vibrant blooms. The town itself felt like something out of the old travel guide he'd seen in the bookshop, a peaceful, unhurried place with a quiet charm. The tiny harbour came into view as he rounded a corner, and Aki stopped in his tracks. Boats bobbed gently in the water, their colourful hulls reflected in the calm surface of the sea. The air was filled with the distant cries of seagulls, and the rhythmic lap of small waves against the dock was soothing. Aki stood there for a moment, letting the scene wash over him. It was everything he had imagined and more. The noise and grime of the city felt like a distant memory, replaced by the soft murmur of the tide and the warmth of the sun on his furry ears and face. He checked Marjorie's notes again, his eyes falling on the name of the cafe. The Harbour's Rest Café. Following her directions, he walked along the curve of the harbour wall, the scent of salt and seaweed heavy in the air. Fishing boats bobbed gently in the water below, their paint weathered but vibrant against the muted tones of the sea. The path led him toward a short incline, and as he climbed, the view opened up, revealing the harbour stretching out below like a picture from one of the books Marjorie had shown him. At the top of the hill, nestled between a small cluster of colourful weathered shops, he saw it. The Harbour's Rest Café stood with an understated charm, its sign carved from a single slab of driftwood and painted in soft blue letters that matched the shutters on its windows. Flower boxes brimming with marigolds and daisies framed the entrance, and large windows revealed a cosy interior where a few patrons lingered over steaming mugs. The entire place exuded a warmth that seemed to draw Aki closer. He paused at the base of the hill, his breath catching as he took it in. This was it, the place Marjorie had spoken of so often. The cafe where, if things went well, his life might finally begin to shift. The late morning sun lit the cobblestones in dappled patterns, and the sign above the door swung gently in the breeze. Aki swallowed hard, his tail curling nervously as he stepped forward. Through the windows, he could see the soft hum of activity inside, the shuffle of chairs, quiet laughter, and the comforting clink of dishes. Something about it felt safe, like a place where, just maybe, he could allow himself to wonder if he might belong. His ears twitched at the faint sounds drifting through the windows, the murmur of voices, the clinking of dishes. It all seemed so ordinary, yet to him it felt monumental. the weight of possibility pressed against his chest, mingling with a deep fear of failure. What if this didn't work out? What if they didn't like or want him? He took a deep breath. Just one step at a time, he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible as he steeled his resolve, reached for the door and pushed it open. A small bell chimed above him, and the scent of freshly baked bread and coffee quickly enveloped him. A woman behind the counter looked up, her face brightening as she caught sight of him. "You must be Aki," she said warmly, stepping around the counter to greet him. Aki nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, ma'am." "Welcome to Bramblewick," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Mrs. Harding. Marjorie's told me so much about you." Her smile was kind, her voice full of warmth, and Aki felt the tight knot of anxiety in his chest begin to loosen a little. Aki nodded again, his ears twitching slightly as he reached out to shake her hand. "It's nice to meet you," he said softly, his voice tinged with nerves. "Well, come in, dear," Mrs. Harding said. She encouraged him to take off his coat and hang it on the stand next to the door, then motioned toward a table by the window. "Why don't you take a seat over there? I'll fetch us some tea. Marjorie said you're quite fond of it." Aki hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Thank you," he said softly, stepping over to the small table and settling into the chair. The soft light streaming through the window cast a warm glow over the polished wooden floors, and Aki felt a quiet calm settle over him despite his nerves. Mrs. Harding returned a moment later, with 2 steaming cups balanced neatly on a small tray. "Here we are," she said brightly, placing one in front of him before sitting down across the table. The soft clink of Mrs. Harding's teacup broke the brief silence as she leaned forward, her warm eyes studying Aki. "Marjorie told me so much about you, Aki," she said, her tone kind. "She spoke about your dedication and the care you put into your work, how you bring kindness into everything you do." Aki's ears twitched slightly, and he glanced down at his hands, his cheeks warming. "She's too kind," he murmured softly. "She's honest," she replied with a small smile. "And from what I've seen so far, I'd say she's right. You've got a presence about you, quiet but thoughtful. That's something people notice, you know." Aki hesitated, unsure how to respond, his tail curling lightly around the leg of his chair. "Thank you," he said softly. "So, tell me, Aki," she said, leaning forward, her tone warm but curious. "What made you decide to want to leave the city? It's not an easy thing to do, I imagine." Aki hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. I just needed a change," he said finally. "The city is loud and busy, and it's hard to explain." "It feels too much," Mrs. Harding offered gently. Aki nodded quickly, his ears perking slightly in surprise. "Yes, it's overwhelming. You're surrounded by people, but it's like no one really notices you, like you're invisible." Mrs. Harding's heart ached at his words, but she kept her expression calm and steady. "I've heard Nico aren't always treated well in the city," she said softly. "That can't be an easy way to live." Aki hesitated, his ears flattening slightly as he glanced down at the table. "It's not," he admitted quietly. "For most of us, the city is all we've ever known. But it's hard." Mrs. Harding nodded, her gaze encouraging him to continue. Aki's voice softened, his words spilling out hesitantly. "People already ignore each other there, and for Neko, it's even worse. Most people think we're weak or different or not worth much, and no matter how hard you try, you can't change the way they look at you. Mrs. Harding's expression softened, and she reached out to rest a hand lightly over his. "That sounds incredibly lonely," she said, her tone filled with quiet empathy. Aki nodded faintly, his shoulders hunching as though the weight of his words pressed down on him. "It is," he whispered. "I'll admit, I've only ever met a Nico once before, years ago in the city," Mrs. Harding said gently. "But with you, it's not your ears or tail that stand out to me. It's the way you carry yourself. There's a quiet strength in you, Aki, and a kindness that I think the people of this little town will come to love. Bramblewick might be small, but it's nothing like the city. It's a place that sees people for who they are, not what they are." Aki's ears twitched slightly, his tail curling loosely around the chair leg. That's good to know," he said softly, though his voice trembled slightly, as though he wasn't sure he believed her. "Bravery is something Marjorie mentioned about you too," Mrs. Harding said, her smile warm but steady. "How you've chosen to step away from what you've always known, to look for something new, something better. That takes a kind of strength not everyone has, you know." "I don't feel very brave," Aki murmured, his voice barely audible. "In a way it feels like I'm running away." Mrs. Harding tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "Sometimes leaving isn't running away, Aki. Sometimes it's about finding where you're meant to be. Bramblewick may be small, but it has a way of making people feel at home. I think you'd find that here." She studied him for a moment longer, her brow softening. "You seem so nervous," she said gently. "What are you worried about? It's okay. You can tell me." Aki hesitated, his ears twitching as he glanced at the table. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "I'm worried I won't be good enough," he admitted. "And what if the people here don't accept me, like in the city?" Her hand reached out and gently patted his in a reassuring gesture. "I've lived in this town my whole life, so trust me when I say you've got nothing to be worried about, Aki. In this town, it's not about where you come from, it's about who you are. And everything Marjorie's told me, everything I see right now, tells me you'd be a wonderful fit here. More importantly, I have a feeling you could be very happy here." He didn't answer right away, his chest tightening with a swirl of nerves and cautious hope. "Now," Mrs. Harding said, her tone brightening as she pulled back slightly, "let me give you a little tour of the cafe. Then maybe we'll see what kind of coffee you can make, Mrs. Harding rose from her chair, motioning for Aki to follow her. He stood quickly, clutching his satchel to his side as his tail curled cautiously behind him. "Let's start with the kitchen," she said, leading him through a small archway behind the counter. The scent of freshly baked bread and pastries greeted him immediately, warm and inviting. Aki's ears perked slightly at the comforting aroma. "This is where all the magic happens," Mrs. Harding said with a smile, gesturing to the modest but well-kept space. "We keep things simple but fresh. Every morning we bake the bread and cakes right here." Aki nodded, his eyes flicking over the neatly organised shelves and the large wooden workbench in the centre of the room. It was nothing like the chaotic kitchens he had seen in the city. There was an air of calm here, a steady rhythm that felt entirely different from the rush he was used to. Mrs. Harding paused, watching his expression. "What do you think?" she asked gently. "It's so peaceful," Aki said softly, his tail flicking once. I like it. Her smile widened. Good. That's what we aim for. No yelling, no rushing, just good work done with care. She led him back out to the cafe floor, where a couple of patrons sat chatting quietly over steaming mugs. This is the heart of the place, she said, gesturing to the tables. We don't get the same rush as city cafes, but we have our busy moments. Most of our customers are locals, though we do get the odd traveller passing through and folks on holiday during the summertime. Aki glanced around, his ears twitching as he took in the cosy atmosphere. It was a far cry from the noisy, crowded cafes he had worked in before. Mrs. Harding walked behind the counter, motioning for Aki to join her. Now, how about we see if you've got the makings of a barista? Aki hesitated for only a moment, then stepped forward, his tail flicking nervously. Here, she said, reaching for an apron hanging on a nearby hook. You'll need one of these. It's all part of the look. She handed him the apron, branded with the Harbour's Rest cafe logo, and Aki happily slipped it on over his head. His hands tied the strings neatly behind his back, and his tail flicked once as he adjusted it. Mrs. Harding smiled as she stepped back, her gaze lingering on Aki. Standing there in his neatly tied apron, his best shirt still perfectly pressed, his hair smooth, and his tail lightly swaying. In her eyes, he was a wonderful sight to behold. His delicate features, framed by those big, soft Neko ears, seemed to glow with a quiet, adorable charm that was both endearing and striking. For a moment, she simply took in the sight of him standing in her cafe, catching her off guard. Well, she said, her voice warm but slightly breathless. If that isn't just the picture of perfection, I don't know what is. Aki blinked, his ears flattening slightly in shy embarrassment as his cheeks flushed. Oh, thank you, he murmured, his tail curling nervously behind him. He glanced down at the apron, adjusting the strings as if to busy his hands, before looking down at the complicated-looking coffee machine before him. I've used similar machines before, Aki admitted softly, glancing at the espresso machine. Mrs. Harding raised an eyebrow, surprised. Oh? Well, that's great. Feel free to give it a go. I'd like you to make an espresso. Don't be afraid to ask if you need anything. Aki nodded, his hand steady as he reached for a portafilter, inserting it into the coffee bean grinder. His movements, while cautious, were practiced. He tamped the coffee grounds with precision, adjusting the settings without hesitation. When he activated the machine, the rich, dark espresso poured smoothly into the cup. Mrs. Harding leaned in, her eyebrows rising in surprise. Well, would you look at that? She said warmly. She reached down, picked up the cup and tasted it. Aki glanced at her nervously. Is it all right? All right, she echoed, a large smile spreading across her face. It's perfect. You've definitely done this before, haven't you? A faint blush crept over Aki's cheeks as he nodded. Maybe, once or twice, he said softly, the hint of a shy smile tugging at his lips. I worked with machines like this in the city. They were a bit more complicated, but I got used to them. Mrs. Harding chuckled, shaking her head. I'll say you did. That's as good a cup as any I've seen. If you could do that every time, we'd have customers lining up down the street. Aki's tail swayed slightly at the compliment, his ears perking up. Thank you, he said softly. Well, Mrs. Harding said, stepping back and gesturing to a tray of pastries on the counter. Let's see how you do with the deliveries. Table 2's waiting. Let's see if you can deliver these without spilling them. Aki's ears twitched nervously, but he nodded, carefully arranging the tray in his hands. As he crossed the room, his steps light and deliberate, he was acutely aware of Mrs. Harding watching him. When he returned with the empty tray, she nodded approvingly. You've clearly done this before too, she said with a knowing smile. More than a few times, he admitted shyly, his tail curling slightly. Well, she said, setting the tray aside, I think we're off to a good start. Aki blinked, his ears perking slightly. Does that mean? Mrs. Harding placed a hand gently on his shoulder, her expression warm. It means you've got what it takes, Aki. If you want the job, it's yours. Really? He whispered. Yes, really, she replied, her voice steady. I'd be proud to have you as part of the team. Aki held his breath as her words sank in. He stared at her, his wide eyes shimmering with disbelief. You mean, I have the job? He whispered, his voice trembling. Mrs. Harding nodded, her warm smile unwavering. If you want it, Aki, it's yours. For a moment he couldn't speak. His chest tightened, and his tail flicked softly behind him as he clutched the edge of the counter. No one had ever said those words to him before, not like this, not with kindness and sincerity. I don't know what to say, he murmured, his eyes welling up, his voice barely audible. You don't have to say anything, Mrs. Harding replied gently, but I want you to know I've seen how much you care, about your work, about the people around you. That's rare, Aki, and it's exactly what we need here. Aki looked down, his ears twitching as he tried to steady the overwhelming emotions rising within him. Thank you, he said at last, his voice thick with gratitude. I'll do my best. I promise. Mrs. Harding's smile widened. That's all I could ever ask. And please, Aki, call me Isabel. Mrs. Harding is so old-fashioned. She reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. I've got a feeling this is going to be the start of something wonderful. Aki nodded, his heart swelling with a cautious but undeniable hope. Aki and the Bramblewick Café, Chapter 12. A place to call home. Aki looked up as Isabel's warm expression softened even further. Now that's all sorted. Marjorie told me you've never seen the sea, she said gently, her voice tinged with quiet wonder. His ears flicked slightly and he nodded. I've seen pictures, but no, never in real life, in person. A soft smile spread across her face, and she clasped her hands together as if making a decision. Well, we can't let you leave Bramblewick without seeing the sea, she said warmly. It's just a short walk from here, and I'd be honoured to show it to you before you go, if you'd like that, of course. I wouldn't want to intrude if you'd prefer to experience it on your own. Aki's eyes widened, a spark of both curiosity and apprehension lighting within them. Are you sure? I wouldn't want to take up your time. And what about the cafe? Oh, don't worry. One of my other staff will be here momentarily. They can take over for a while, Mrs. Harding said firmly. I would be so happy, Aki, to show you the sea. And if you're going to consider staying here, you should get to know the town a little better. So if you're up for it, we can have a little look around. I can show you the sights. Before Aki could answer, the door to the cafe swung open, and a young woman stepped inside, shrugging off her jacket. Her cheerful expression froze for a moment as her eyes landed on Aki, her jaw slightly slack. Oh, she said softly, her gaze locking onto him. Wow. Aki shifted uncomfortably, his tail curling slightly behind him as he offered a shy smile. Hello, he said softly. Beth, meet Aki, Isabel said, stepping beside him with a knowing smile. He's going to be working with us in the cafe. Beth blinked, her cheeks colouring as she finally managed to speak. Aki? Right. Hi, she said, her voice a little higher than usual. "It's really nice to meet you." "You too," Aki replied, smiling, his ears twitching slightly. Beth's gaze lingered on his ears and tail for a moment, her curiosity evident. "I hope this isn't rude, but I've never met a Nico before. You're, well..." She trailed off, her blush deepening. "It's okay," Aki said gently, his smile growing warmer. "It happens a lot in the city. People are often curious, especially if it's their first time meeting a Neko." Beth nodded, her nervous laugh breaking the tension. "I can see why. You're, She hesitated, then gestured vaguely toward his ears. "Do people ever, want to pet my ears?" Aki finished for her, his tone kind and understanding. Beth's eyes widened slightly. "I mean, not that I would, unless, do people actually ask?" "They do," Aki admitted with a small chuckle. "It happens a lot in cafes. And I don't mind, really. Most of us don't. It's kind of nice when people are kind about it." Beth relaxed a little, her smile returning. "That's good to know. I wouldn't, unless you were okay with it. Not that I'm saying I want to..." "Beth," Isabel interrupted with a laugh, her voice light. "Take a breath. You're going to scare the poor boy off." "Sorry," Beth said quickly, her grin sheepish. "I'll stop rambling now." Aki smiled softly, his tail swaying slightly. "It's okay, really." Isabel chuckled again before turning to Aki. "Beth, can you cover the counter for the next hour or so? I want to show Aki the beach. He's never seen the sea before, and then we'll have a look around town for a while." Beth blinked, her brows lifting in surprise. "You've never seen the sea?" she asked, her tone a mix of disbelief and wonder. I guess it makes sense if you've always lived in the city, but... wow." She glanced toward Isabel, then back at Aki, her expression softening. "You're going to love it. It's like nothing else in the world." Beth's expression brightened, her initial nervousness melting into a warm smile. "But yes, of course. The cafe is in good hands. You two go ahead. I'll make sure everything runs smoothly here." "Thank you, Beth," Isabel said, shrugging into her coat. She turned to Aki, her smile softening. "Come on, Aki. Let's show you what Bramblewick has to offer." As they stepped out of the cafe into the crisp air, the faint scent of salt and seaweed drifted on the breeze. Aki paused, his ears twitching as he caught the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. "Can you hear it?" Isabel asked, her voice filled with a quiet excitement. Aki nodded slowly, his tail curling slightly behind him. "It sounds different," he murmured. "So much bigger than I imagined." "You'll see soon enough," Isabel said, leading him down a narrow cobbled lane that sloped gently toward the harbour. The little town unfolded around them, its quaint stone cottages and brightly painted shop fronts glowing in the late afternoon light. Aki took in the sights, his wide eyes darting to every detail, the colourful boats bobbing in the harbour, the gulls circling overhead, and the children laughing as they chased one another along the sandy edge of the quay. They followed a small road away from the harbour along the waterline until they reached the edge of a beautiful sandy beach. Isabel paused, letting Aki take the lead. He stepped forward tentatively, the sand crunching softly beneath his shoes. The vast expanse of blue stretched before him, the horizon blending seamlessly with the sky. For a moment, Aki stood still, the sight and sound of the sea washing over him like a gentle tide. His ears twitched, his tail swaying as the salty breeze ruffled his hair. "It's so beautiful," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. Isabel watched him quietly, her heart warming at the wonder in his expression. "It is, isn't it?" she said softly. "No matter how many times I see it, it never gets old." Aki crouched down, hesitantly reaching out to touch the cool sand. He let it run through his fingers, his movements slow and deliberate. "It feels alive," he said, more to himself than to Isabel. "It is," she replied, stepping closer. "The sea has a way of making everything feel connected. It's one of the reasons I could never leave Bramblewick." Aki looked up at her, his wide eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and longing. "Do you think someone like me could belong here?" Isabel smiled gently, crouching beside him. "I don't just think it, Aki. I know it. Bramblewick has a way of making people feel at home, no matter where they come from." For a while they sat together on the sand in silence, the sound of the waves filling the space between them. Eventually Isabel stood, brushing the sand from her hands. "Come on," she said, gesturing with her hand. "There's more to see." Aki hesitated, then climbed to his feet, letting her guide him back toward the town. As they wandered through the winding streets, Isabel pointed out the little details that made Bramblewick special. The old stone church with its ivy-covered walls, the tiny bakery with its warm, inviting scent, and the cosy bookshop where time seemed to stand still. By the time they returned to the cafe, the town had taken root in Aki's heart. The thought of leaving the city no longer felt like an impossible dream, but a quiet decision solidifying within him. As Isabel pushed open the cafe door, the familiar jingle of the bell brought Aki back to the present, but his heart felt lighter, his chest less burdened. Beth looked up from the counter, her face brightening when she saw them. "How was it?" "It was wonderful," Isabel replied warmly, slipping off her coat. "I think someone might have fallen in love with Bramblewick." Aki's ears twitched, and he glanced down shyly, his tail curling behind him. "It's everything I didn't know I needed," he admitted softly, his voice carrying a hint of wonder. Beth grinned, leaning forward slightly. "That's how it starts. Bramblewick has a way of sneaking into your heart before you even realize it." Aki looked up at her, his ears twitching slightly, and took a steady breath. "I've decided," he said softly but firmly. "I want to take the job, and I want to live here," he said, his voice steady despite the faint tremor of emotion. Isabel smiled, her expression both proud and relieved. "That's wonderful to hear, Aki," she said gently. "And don't you worry. We'll make sure everything falls into place, one step at a time." Beth clapped her hands together, her excitement evident. "This is so exciting! You're going to love it here, Aki, and I'm sure everyone will love you too." Aki's cheeks flushed, and he ducked his head slightly, overwhelmed by their support. "Thank you," he murmured, "for everything. I never thought I'd find a place like this." Isabel reached out, giving his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You deserve it, Aki, and we're happy to have you here." For the first time in what felt like forever, Aki felt a sense of belonging, not just to a place, but to the people around him. The cafe, the town, and the sea, they all felt like pieces of a puzzle that had finally started to fit together. As they settled back into the cafe, Aki sipped the tea Isabel had prepared for him, the warmth spreading through him in a way that mirrored the contentment blooming in his chest. The decision to stay in Bramblewick felt like stepping into a long-awaited dream. "I suppose the next thing to figure out," Aki began, hesitantly, glancing up at Isabel, "is a place to live." Isabel set down her own cup, her expression thoughtful. "Well, there are a few options," she said, leaning back slightly. "We have a notice board just outside the post office where people advertise rooms to rent. It might be worth a look." Beth chimed in from behind the counter, her voice eager. "Oh, and there's Mrs. Dobson's boarding house on Hill Lane. It's small, but I've heard good things about it. Though—" she hesitated, her cheeks colouring slightly. "She can be a bit nosy." Aki's tail flicked nervously, and he nodded, though the idea of a busy boarding house didn't quite sit right. Isabel tapped her fingers lightly on the table, her eyes brightening with an idea. "Actually, there is one more possibility. It's nothing grand, mind you, but there's a little room upstairs above the cafe. It's been empty for a while now. I usually keep it for visiting friends or family, but you'd be welcome to use it, at least until you find something more permanent." Aki's ears perked, his eyes widening slightly. "Really? How much would it cost?" Isabel smiled, waving a hand dismissively. "Oh, don't worry about that. It's free of charge, Aki. You're helping me here in the cafe, and this is the least I can do to help you settle in." Aki's cheeks flushed, his ears flattening slightly in shy gratitude. "That's incredibly kind of you. Thank you." "Come on," Isabel said, rising from her chair. "Let me show you. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean and cosy." Aki followed her up the narrow staircase at the back of the cafe, his heart thudding softly with anticipation. As Isabel unlocked the door and stepped aside, Aki's breath caught slightly. The room was small, just as she had said, no larger than his one-room apartment back in the city, but this room was bright and inviting. A single bed with a neatly made patchwork quilt stood against one wall, next to a wooden wardrobe that looked well used but sturdy. A small window overlooked the quiet street below, offering a glimpse of the sea's horizon in the distance. Aki's gaze lingered there, his heart swelling at the thought of seeing the ocean every day. "There's a desk here for you too," Isabel said, gesturing to the simple but sturdy wooden desk beneath the window. "And if you're lucky, you'll catch the sunsets from here. They can be breathtaking." Aki stepped inside, his tail swaying slowly as he took in the details. Compared to his apartment in the city, with its cracked walls and constant chill, this room felt like a palace. "It's perfect," he said softly, turning to Isabel with a small, grateful smile. "Thank you so much. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Isabel replied, her smile warm. "I'm just glad it suits you. We'll figure out the rest as we go." Aki ran his hand lightly over the quilt, his ears twitching as he absorbed the reality of it all. Even as a temporary arrangement, it was more than he could have ever dreamed of. Aki and the Bramblewick Café, Chapter 13. The beginning of the end. The train hissed softly as it pulled into the Bramblewick station, its doors sliding open to reveal a modest, nearly empty carriage. Aki stepped inside, clutching his satchel to his chest. His ears twitched with the faint hum of the engine, and his heart raced, not with fear, but with something much brighter, much lighter: excitement. He slid into a seat by the window, his tail curling tightly against his leg as he placed the satchel on his lap. The station platform was quiet, the last traces of Bramblewick etched into the soft golden light of the setting sun. The train gave a gentle jolt as it began to move, the rhythm of the wheels on the tracks a soothing backdrop. Aki pressed his forehead lightly against the window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the town slip away. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just daydreaming about something better. He was moving toward it. The thought filled his chest with a strange, exhilarating warmth, a mixture of hope and disbelief. He could almost see it in his mind. The cafe, the room above it, with the little wardrobe, and the window that overlooked the sea. He pictured Isabel's kind smile, Beth's cheerful laughter, and the quiet streets of Bramblewick where even the air felt different. It was all waiting for him, and for the first time, Aki allowed himself to believe that it was real. The city seemed so far behind him now, its weight already starting to lift from his shoulders. He rested his hand on the satchel, the edges of his notepad just visible inside. Carefully written inside were all the details of his plans, his notice period, the belongings he would take, the things he would leave behind. But as the train rumbled further away from Bramblewick, a faint shadow began to creep into his thoughts. The city wasn't gone yet. It loomed somewhere ahead, waiting, its edges growing sharper as the train sped closer. The joy in his chest dimmed slightly as memories of the city began to resurface. The narrow streets clogged with noise and fumes, the cold indifference of the crowds, the way his tail would curl tightly behind him as he hurried through the alleyways, always watching, always wary. And yet, this time it felt different. Aki sat up a little straighter, his ears perking slightly as he turned his gaze back to the window. The city was oppressive. He could feel that more keenly than ever now. But it wasn't forever. He allowed himself to notice it all, to feel the anxiety and tension that the thought of the city brought. But unlike before, those feelings didn't overwhelm him. The knowledge that this chapter of his life was coming to an end gave him the strength to bear it. The train began to slow, the dull glow of the city lights creeping into view through the smudged glass. Aki's tail flicked nervously, but he took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was it. His final days in the city were starting now. And while the weight of its reality pressed on him as heavily as ever, he held on to the image of Bramblewick, the harbour, the sea, the people who had already begun to welcome him into their world. The train pulled into the station with a screech of brakes, the bustling noise of the city immediately flooding his senses. Aki hesitated for just a moment before standing, his grip on the satchel firm. This was just the beginning of the end, and for the first time, Aki felt ready to face it. The city greeted Aki with its usual unrelenting noise and chaos. The train's doors slid open, and the air immediately felt heavier, thicker, carrying with it the stale mix of exhaust fumes and damp concrete. Aki stepped onto the platform, his satchel clutched tightly to his side, his ears flattening slightly against the dull roar of the crowd. He paused for a moment, letting the tide of commuters sweep past him. It was all so familiar, yet something felt different now. The city hadn't changed. If anything, it felt harsher after his brief escape. But Aki's perspective had shifted. Bramblewick was still fresh in his mind, its quiet streets and gentle air, a stark contrast to the world he had known his entire life. Adjusting his satchel, Aki began the walk back to his apartment. The streets were crowded as usual, a sea of people moving in all directions with barely a glance toward him. He kept his head down, his tail curling protectively around his leg as he weaved through the throng. As he passed the cafe where he worked, his steps slowed involuntarily. Through the window, he could see the familiar chaos inside. The crowded tables, the impatient customers, and the manager barking orders at one of the servers. The sight sent a pang of anxiety through his chest, but also a strange sense of detachment. Aki didn't step inside. Not yet. He wasn't ready to face that world again, not when the memory of Bramblewick still lingered so strongly. Instead, he continued on to his apartment, the route so familiar he could have walked it blindfolded. The building loomed ahead, its crumbling facade and graffiti-smeared walls a stark reminder of the life he was preparing to leave behind. The stairwell smelled of damp and mildew as he climbed to his floor, his footsteps echoing in the narrow space. When he reached his door, Aki hesitated, his hand hovering over the worn handle. Inside, the apartment was exactly as he had left it. Small, cramped, and cold. The peeling wallpaper and flickering overhead lights seemed more oppressive than ever, and for a moment Aki just stood in the doorway, staring at the space he had called home for his whole life. His gaze fell on the little collection of belongings by the bed, the photograph of his parents, the worn blanket his mother had made, and Momo, his beloved stuffed toy. These were the only things in the apartment that felt like they truly belonged to him, the only things that carried any warmth. Aki set his satchel down carefully and crossed the room to pick up Momo. He held the toy close to his chest, his tail swaying gently behind him as he sat on the edge of the bed. The weight of the city pressed down on him again, but this time it didn't crush him. Aki allowed himself to feel it, to acknowledge the years he had spent here, the good and the bad. He didn't hate the city. It had been his home, and in its way it had shaped him. But it wasn't his home anymore. For the first time, the thought didn't bring sadness. Instead, it brought a quiet, resolute sense of peace. Aki splashed cold water onto his face, staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror above the basin. His ears twitched with restless energy, and his chest felt tight. Not with anxiety this time, but with an overwhelming sense of excitement. He couldn't sit still. He ran a comb through his hair, tidied his clothes, and gave Momo a quick pat where the toy sat on the bed. "I got the job," he whispered, the words tasting surreal as they left his lips. A grin spread across his face, and for a fleeting moment, the dull, oppressive weight of the city felt distant. Grabbing his satchel, he hurried out of the apartment, descending the narrow staircase 2 steps at a time. His heart felt as though it might burst from his chest, and the grimy streets and the distant hum of city noise seemed less suffocating. The bookshop bell chimed softly as Aki pushed the door open, and the familiar warmth of the shop enveloped him. Marjorie looked up from behind the counter, her expression lighting up when she saw him. "There you are," she greeted, setting aside the book she'd been thumbing through. "You're back earlier than I thought. Did everything go all right?" Aki froze in the doorway, his eyes brimming with emotion as his tail swayed behind him. "Marjorie," he began, his voice trembling with barely contained excitement. I got the job." Marjorie's eyes widened, and she clapped her hands together, her smile blooming. "Oh, Aki, that's wonderful news." "I can't believe it," Aki continued, stepping closer. She actually said she'd be proud to have me. I met her and we talked, and she showed me around the town. I even saw the sea for the first time. It was all so perfect, Marjorie. It's like a dream." Marjorie's expression softened, and she hurried over, quickly rounding the counter and pulling him into a warm hug. Aki tensed for a moment, unused to such gestures, but quickly relaxed, his ears flattening slightly as a few happy tears slipped down his cheeks. "I don't know how to thank you," he gasped, his voice breaking. "None of this would have happened without you. You believed in me when no one else did." Marjorie pulled back, her hands holding his shoulders. "You did this, Aki. I just gave you a little push. The rest was all you." "But you set it in motion," Aki insisted, his gaze earnest. "You've done so much for me. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Marjorie chuckled softly, her eyes glistening. "You don't owe me anything, Aki. Watching you find your path, seeing you light up like this, it's all the thanks I'll ever need." Aki nodded, brushing at his cheeks and offering her a shaky but heartfelt smile. "I'll never forget this. I promise." Marjorie guided him to the familiar table near the window, setting a cup of tea in front of him. "So," she said, her voice warm, "tell me everything. How was it? What's the town like? And Isabel, did she live up to my description?" Aki's tail flicked with enthusiasm as he recounted every detail. The cosy cafe, the bustling harbour, the kindness of Isabel, and the breathtaking sight of the sea. His voice quickened with excitement as he added, "And she's even letting me stay in a little room above the cafe. It's so cosy, Marjorie. It's clean and dry with a big window where I can see the sea and the sunsets. It's better than anything I ever imagined." Marjorie's eyes softened, and she reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "That sounds perfect, Aki. Just perfect." When he finished, his voice quieter now, he looked down at his tea. "I'm going to give my notice at the cafe tomorrow," he said softly. "I've only got a week left there, and I think I'll leave the apartment as soon as I can. I don't want to stay in the city any longer than I have to." Marjorie nodded, her gaze steady and supportive. "You've got everything lined up, Aki, and I'll be here every step of the way. Just promise me one thing." Aki glanced up, his ears twitching. "What's that?" "Don't forget to write," she said with a teasing smile. He laughed softly, his heart swelling with gratitude and determination. "I won't. I promise." For the first time in his life, Aki felt the oppressive hold of the city loosening its grip on him. The dream of a new life wasn't just a faint hope anymore, it was real, and it was waiting for him. Aki and the Bramblewick Café, Chapter 14. The final week. The morning was still quiet as Aki approached the cafe, the streetlights casting a pale glow against the damp pavement. He'd left his apartment earlier than usual, his steps brisk despite the knots in his stomach. He wanted to be there ahead of time. There would be no chance for the manager to accuse him of being late today. The doorbell jingled softly as he stepped inside. The cafe was dimly lit, the chairs still stacked on tables, and the faint aroma of stale coffee hung in the air. The manager stood behind the counter, flipping through a clipboard, her usual scowl firmly in place. She didn't look up immediately, which gave Aki a moment to steady his breathing. "Morning," he said softly, his tail curling nervously behind him, as he adjusted the strap of his satchel. She glanced up, her expression flat. "You're early for once," she remarked, her tone clipped. Aki swallowed, his hands tightening slightly on the satchel. I need to talk to you," he said, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. The manager raised an eyebrow, setting the clipboard aside. "This better be important, I'm busy. What do you want?" she asked, already sounding exasperated. Aki hesitated for the briefest moment, then took a breath and stepped closer. "I'm giving my notice," he said, his voice soft but clear. The words hung in the air for a moment, and the manager's expression froze before twisting into a look of incredulity. "You're what?" "I'm leaving," Aki repeated, his ears twitching slightly. "I've been offered a job somewhere else. I'll work my week's notice, of course." She blinked, then let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You've got to be kidding me. You think you can just leave like that? Do you have any idea how much trouble you're going to cause?" Aki's tail curled tighter, but he held his ground. "I'm contractually obligated to give a week's notice," he said quietly. "That's what I'm doing." The manager set her hands on her hips, her voice rising slightly. "And what about the rest of us, huh? You think we can just carry on without you? You know how short-staffed we are already." Aki's ears twitched slightly, and despite his nerves, A faint, almost imperceptible smile tugged at his lips. "I didn't know you valued me so much," he said softly, his voice steady but tinged with quiet defiance. The manager blinked, her expression hardening as a flush of irritation crept into her cheeks. "Don't get smart with me," she snapped, her tone sharp. "You're not indispensable, you know. It's the principle of it, the inconvenience you're causing. Do you have no loyalty? We've provided you with a good job here for years, and this is the thanks we get? How incredibly ungrateful." Aki's ears flattened slightly, but he didn't look away. Her words stung, but they weren't new. He'd heard them before, every veiled insult and biting comment. But this time, something inside him refused to back down. "Loyalty?" Aki said softly, his voice steady despite the tight knot in his chest. "It works both ways. I've been loyal every day I've worked here. Every time I showed up on time, stayed late when no one else would, and never complained, no matter how I was treated. But loyalty doesn't mean staying in a place where I'm not valued, not appreciated." The manager's eyes narrowed, her lips parting to respond, but Aki didn't stop. His voice grew firmer, though it remained calm. "I'm not ungrateful. I've worked hard every single day, and I've always shown respect, even when it wasn't returned. But now I've been given a chance to work somewhere I'll be treated with kindness and dignity, somewhere where loyalty is mutual and my efforts are acknowledged and appreciated, and I won't apologize for choosing that for myself." He paused, his tail curling tightly behind him as he steadied his breath. "I'll finish out my week and do my job, just like I always have. But after that, I'm leaving." His voice stayed calm even as his heart raced. "Maybe if this place had ever made me feel like I mattered, I wouldn't have had to make that choice." The manager's face twisted in frustration, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. For a moment, it looked as though she might lash out with another tirade, but no words came. Instead, her jaw tightened, and she exhaled sharply through her nose, waving a dismissive hand in his direction. "Fine!" she snapped. "Do whatever you want, but don't expect a glowing reference, not from me." Aki stood there, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. He hesitated only briefly before turning to head back onto the cafe floor, his tail curling tightly behind him. As he walked away, he glanced back over his shoulder, his voice quiet but firm. "I wasn't counting on one." The cafe felt as heavy as ever, but a strange calm settled over him. For the first time in years, he had spoken up for himself, not in anger, but with authentic purpose. He'd expected to feel fear, but instead, there was a small, surprising sense of something else. Freedom. Aki knew the week ahead wouldn't be easy. The manager's icy glares, the whispered remarks from his co-workers, and the uncomfortable tension that now filled the cafe would make every shift feel twice as long. But none of it could weigh him down the way it used to. For the first time, he could see the finish line, and it made everything just a little more bearable. The final hours of his shift dragged on, filled with the usual clatter of plates and the hum of conversation, though he moved through it with a new sense of resolve. As he tied up the last bag of rubbish and swept the floor one final time, he allowed himself a small private moment to breathe. He untied his apron, folding it neatly and placing it on the wall hook, where it would sit until his next shift. Glancing around the empty cafe, he felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. This place, for all its weight, had been his world for years. But it wasn't home. It never had been. With his coat on, Aki slung his satchel over his shoulder, the familiar weight of it grounding him. He stepped out into the cool evening air, the cafe door clicking shut behind him. The sky was darkening, the first few stars flickering faintly in the distance. He paused for a moment on the street, letting the stillness settle around him. He took a deep breath, his chest feeling lighter than it had in a long time. Just a few more days to go, and his nightmare would be over. As Aki walked toward home that evening, the weight of the day settled over him. The confrontation with his manager had been draining, but the thought of the future, the new life awaiting him, kept his spirits from sinking too low. He couldn't help but feel a flicker of excitement every time he imagined the little seaside cafe, the warmth of Isabel's smile, and the cosy room with its view of the sea. He found himself standing outside the familiar door of the second-hand bookstore. The soft glow of light through the window was a welcome sight, a promise of the comfort and kindness that awaited inside. The bell chimed softly as he stepped in, and Marjorie looked up from behind the counter, her face lighting up instantly. "Aki, twice in 2 days. This must be my lucky week," she said warmly, setting down the book she'd been reading. Aki offered her a small smile, his tail flicking lightly behind him. I just wanted to stop by and tell you how it went today." Marjorie's expression softened, and she gestured for him to sit. "Come on, tell me everything. Was it awful? Did they give you a hard time?" He sat down at the small table, his satchel resting at his feet. "The manager wasn't happy," he admitted. "She said some things, but I stood my ground. I handed in my notice. 1 week from now I'll be free." Marjorie's smile grew wider, her eyes shining with pride. "Good for you, Aki. That couldn't have been easy, but you did it. You're another step closer to your dream now." Aki nodded, a faint blush warming his cheeks. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said softly. "Thank you, Marjorie, for everything." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, her smile turning wistful. "You're a special one, Aki," she said warmly, her voice tinged with emotion. Then, as if remembering something, she reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small envelope, her movements deliberate. "Speaking of steps," she said, holding it out to him with both hands, "I thought this might help with your next one." Aki blinked, his ears twitching as he hesitated before accepting the envelope. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened it. His breath caught when he saw what it held, a neatly folded train ticket and a small stack of banknotes tucked inside. Marjorie's voice was soft but steady. "The tickets for your trip to Bramblewick," Marjorie explained gently. "You've got enough on your plate without worrying about the cost of getting there. And the cash, it's not a lot, but hopefully it'll help towards expenses while you're settling in. Consider it a little parting gift from an old bookshop lady who's rooting for you." Aki's hands trembled, his throat tightening as he held the envelope, his vision blurring with tears. "Marjorie, I don't know what to say." Her expression softened even further, and she reached across the table, her hand resting gently against his cheek. "You don't have to say anything, sweetheart," she said quietly. "Just promise me one thing. When you get to Bramblewick, give yourself the chance to truly start over. You deserve this, Aki. You deserve to be happy." Aki nodded, unable to find his voice as tears spilled over, a small, grateful smile breaking through. He placed his hand gently over hers, pressing it tighter against his cheek in a silent gesture of thanks. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the quiet hum of the shop wrapping around them. Aki traced his fingers along the edges of the envelope, his thoughts drifting to the small cafe, the gentle waves, and the promise of a new and much more meaningful life. At last, Aki tucked the envelope carefully into his satchel, ensuring it was secure. He glanced toward the window where the city lights shimmered faintly in the glass. For so long, those streets had felt like a cage, unforgiving, unyielding. But tonight, they felt different. Tonight, they were simply the backdrop of a life he was leaving behind. As Aki stood to leave, Marjorie reached out one last time, squeezing his hand firmly. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice steady but brimming with affection. The weight of her words settled over him, and he nodded again, his chest feeling both heavy and light at the same time. "I'll make it count. You have my promise," he whispered. And as he stepped into the night, the familiar streets no longer felt so daunting. They were just a passageway now, a bridge to something better. A chapter was closing, but for the first time, Aki wasn't afraid of what came next. Aki and the Bramblewick Café, Chapter 15. The Last Shift. The cafe was as loud and chaotic as ever when Aki arrived for his final day. The sharp clang of dishes and the hum of voices greeted him as he stepped inside, his satchel hanging loosely over one shoulder. He'd made sure to arrive early, giving himself enough time to prepare for what he knew would be a long, grueling day. The manager was already at the counter, her expression sour as she flipped through a clipboard of orders. Her eyes flicked up when she saw him, narrowing slightly. "You're early for once," she muttered. Aki swallowed, offering a polite nod. "I wanted to make sure everything was ready before we opened." She huffed, gesturing toward the back. "Fine. Go and stock the shelves. We're low on sugar and syrups. Make yourself useful for a change while you're still here." The words stung, but Aki let them slide off him. He'd heard far worse during his time here. Stepping into the storeroom, he busied himself with the task, his hands steady, even as his heart raced. It was strange, knowing this was his last day. A part of him felt immense relief, but another part couldn't help but feel a quiet dread, as though the city wasn't quite ready to let him go without one final test. By mid-morning, the cafe was packed. Customers crowded the tables, their voices a dull roar that filled the air. Aki moved through them with practiced ease, delivering orders and clearing dishes. Despite his effort to focus, the tension was palpable. It wasn't long before trouble found him. A group of office workers sat in the corner booth, their suits rumpled and ties loosened after what was likely a long day. Their voices carried across the cafe, loud and self-assured, the kind of tone that always made Aki tread carefully. Balancing a tray of drinks, Aki approached their table. He placed the cups down with steady hands, his tail curling slightly behind him. "Here you are. Enjoy your drinks," he said softly, already turning to leave. "Wait a second," one of them called out, his voice sharp. Aki stopped, his ears twitching nervously. "Yes, sir?" The man leaned forward, his smirk curling. "What's the deal with those ears?" he asked, gesturing toward Aki's head. "Are they real, or are you just wearing them for tips?" The others at the table chuckled, and Aki's cheeks flushed. "They're real," he replied quietly, keeping his tone polite. Another man chimed in, grinning. "What about the tail? Does it wag when you're happy?" The laughter grew louder, cutting through the hum of the cafe. Aki stiffened, his hands gripping the empty tray tightly. He forced himself to stay calm. "I'll come by later to check if you need anything else," he said, trying to retreat. But the first man wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair, picking up his coffee and swirling it lazily. "You know, my niece has a stuffed animal that looks just like you. Same ears, same tail. Do you purr too?" The table erupted in laughter, and Aki's stomach twisted. He felt the weight of their eyes on him, their mockery pressing down like a physical force. "Careful," one of them added, nudging his friend. "Don't get him riled up. He might scratch you." The words stung, but Aki remained silent, his expression carefully neutral as he turned to leave. The words stung, but Aki remained silent, his expression carefully neutral as he turned to leave. As he stepped away, he heard a sudden clatter behind him. The first man's coffee mug had tipped over, spilling its contents across the table. "Hey!" the man shouted. "What the hell, catboy? You spilled my coffee." Aki turned back, startled. "I didn't." "Don't give me excuses," the man interrupted, his tone icy. "Get over here and clean it up, now!" The others watched with smirks as Aki hurried back to the table, grabbing a cloth from his apron. He wiped the table quickly, his hands trembling as the man glared down at him. "Better be more careful next time," the man sneered, tossing a napkin onto the freshly cleaned surface. "Yes, sir," Aki murmured, his voice barely audible. As he walked back to the counter, the laughter followed him, low and cruel. His tail flicked in frustration, but he kept his composure, his mind focused on the thought of this being his last day. The manager's sharp voice cut through his thoughts. "Aki, quit dawdling and get back out there." "Yes, ma'am," he replied automatically, even as his chest tightened. The incident lingered with him for the rest of the shift, the weight of their mockery pressing down like a shadow. By the time the cafe emptied and the doors were locked, Aki felt drained, his body aching with a heaviness that went beyond the physical. When the last table was cleared, the manager approached him, her expression as hard to read as ever. "You'll get your final paycheck at the end of the week," she said curtly. "Don't expect a reference." "I understand," Aki replied softly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. She lingered for a moment, her gaze flicking to his ears and then away, as if searching for the right words. Finally she spoke, her voice quieter than he'd ever heard it. "And good luck with the new job." Aki blinked, caught off guard. For a moment, he thought he'd misheard her. "Thank you," he said carefully, unsure if it was a kindness or something else. She nodded stiffly, her usual sharpness softened just enough to make the moment feel strange and out of place. Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Aki standing there, unsure whether to feel closure or confusion. As Aki stepped outside, the cool evening air hit him like a balm. He could feel the noise and tension of the cafe melt away behind him, replaced by the quiet hum of the city streets. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. It was over. For the first time that day, a smile tugged at his lips. The weight of the cafe, of the city itself, felt a lot lighter. He had survived the worst it had to offer, and now he could finally look forward to what lay ahead. Tomorrow, the real journey would begin. Aki and the Bramblewick Café, Chapter 16. The Last Goodbye. Aki stood in the centre of his small apartment, the dim light from the single bulb casting long shadows across the peeling wallpaper. His belongings lay scattered around him, a small pile of clothes, a few cherished books, and a handful of keepsakes neatly packed into a single large hold-all bag. Next to it sat his satchel, always within reach. The emptiness of the room pressed down on him, the once familiar space now feeling strange and hollow. He had lived here his entire life, ever since his parents had brought him home as a baby. The apartment had been their home, their sanctuary, cramped but filled with warmth and love. Aki's eyes lingered on the faded spot on the wall, where a picture frame had once hung. His mother's smile flashed in his mind, so vivid it almost hurt. He sat down on the edge of his bed, now stripped of its threadbare sheets. In his hands, he held the old photograph of his parents, the one that he had always kept on the wall. They were smiling, arms wrapped around each other, with him nestled between them as a young boy. The memory was so distant It felt like another lifetime. But the ache in his chest was sharp and fresh. "Papa used to sit here," he whispered to no one, his voice trembling as he glanced at the small wooden chair by the table. He could almost see his father's silhouette bent over a book, the soft rustle of pages filling the quiet evenings. And Mama? She'd hum while she cooked, even when there wasn't much to make. His tail curled tightly around his leg as he clutched the photograph closer, his vision blurring with tears. They had been gone for so long, and yet this place, this shabby, imperfect apartment, had always kept a part of them alive. Leaving it now felt like losing them all over again. Aki wiped at his cheeks with the back of his hand, but the tears kept falling, unbidden and unstoppable. "I'll miss you," he murmured, his voice breaking. "I'll miss this." For a long moment, he sat there, letting the memories wash over him, the sound of his father's laughter, the gentle way his mother had stroked his ears when he was upset. He let himself feel the grief and the gratitude, the ache of leaving the only home he'd ever known, and the hope of starting anew. Finally, with a shaky breath, he stood and placed the photograph carefully into his bag, nestled between his books and Momo. He gave the room one last lingering look, his ears flattening slightly. "Well, goodbye," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He turned and walked to the door, his tail swaying low behind him. As he stepped out and closed it softly behind him, the weight on his chest eased just slightly. The apartment, the memories, would always be with him. But now it was time to move forward. The little bell above the bookshop door chimed softly as Aki stepped inside for what he knew would be the last time. The familiar scent of old books wrapped around him like a comforting embrace. But today, it only deepened the ache in his chest. Marjorie looked up from her place at the counter, her face lighting up as always when she saw him. But as he stepped closer, her smile faltered, her sharp eyes catching the subtle tension in his posture, the way his satchel and hold-all hung heavily at his side. "So," she said softly, setting down the book she had been leafing through, "today's the day." Aki nodded, his ears flicking slightly as he struggled to find the words. "I wanted to see you before I left," he said quietly, his tail curling behind him, "to thank you for everything." Marjorie stepped out from behind the counter. Her expression was warm, full of quiet pride. "You've no need to thank me, Aki. You did this. All I did was nudge you in the right direction." "No," Aki said firmly, his voice trembling. "You did so much more than that. You gave me hope when I didn't think I had any left. You believed in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself." His cheeks flushed, his eyes glistening as he looked down. "I don't know how to repay you for that," he whispered. Marjorie reached out and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Oh, my dear Aki," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You've already repaid me, just by finding your way. Seeing you go off to start a new chapter. It's all the thanks I could ever want." Aki swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. "I'll miss you so much," he whispered. "And I'll miss you too," Marjorie replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But I'm not letting you leave without one last gift." She turned and reached behind the counter, pulling out a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with a simple string. She handed it to him with a smile that was both sad and hopeful. "It's a little something to remind you of this place," she said. Aki took the parcel with trembling hands, his tail flicking nervously. "Marjorie, you didn't have to." "Of course I did," she said with a wink. "Go on, open it." Carefully, Aki untied the string and peeled back the paper. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal, the pages blank and waiting to be filled. On the inside cover, Marjorie had written in elegant handwriting, "For Aki, who has the courage to dream, the strength to endure, and the heart to make it all come true. Fill these pages with your story. It's a gift only you can give the world. With love and belief. Always, Marjorie." Aki stared at the inscription, his vision blurring as tears spilled freely down his cheeks. He clutched the journal to his chest, his ears flattening as he looked up at her. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. Marjorie pulled him into a warm, tight embrace, her hand gently stroking his hair. "Go make your mark on the world, Aki," she said softly. "And don't you dare forget to write to me. I want to hear all about it." Aki nodded against her shoulder, his tears soaking into the fabric of her cardigan. "I promise," he said, his voice muffled but full of determination. When they finally pulled apart, Marjorie smiled through her own tears. "Now, off you go," she said, her tone light but trembling with emotion. "You've got a train to catch and a whole new life waiting for you." Aki nodded, wiping his cheeks with the back of his hand. He picked up his bags and gave her one last look, his heart swelling with gratitude and love. "Goodbye, Marjorie," he said softly. "Goodbye, Aki," she replied, her voice steady. "Take care of yourself." As he stepped out into the street, the little bell chimed behind him, a soft farewell to the place that had been his sanctuary. The journal felt solid and reassuring in his hands, a reminder of the woman who had believed in him when no one else had. With one final glance back at the bookshop, Aki squared his shoulders and began the walk to the station, ready to step into the future, waiting for him. The platform was quiet, the hum of the station a gentle backdrop as Aki stood with his satchel over one shoulder and his holdall at his feet. The ticket, now slightly crumpled from where he'd clutched it nervously, rested in his hand. He glanced up at the departure board, the words Bramblewick, 10:05, blinking steadily. This was it. Aki shifted his weight, his tail curling slightly behind him as his gaze swept over the station. It felt surreal, standing here with everything he owned packed into a single bag. For the first time in his life, he was truly leaving. The city loomed all around him, its familiar chaos muted by the hazy morning light. It felt less oppressive now, as though it had loosened its grip on him the moment he'd made the decision to go. But as much as he longed for the peace of Bramblewick, a pang of sadness tugged at his chest. This station, this city, it was the only world he'd ever known. He let out a shaky breath, his ears flattening slightly. Memories swirled around him, unbidden. The laughter of his parents as they sat together on the threadbare couch, the comforting weight of his mother's hand on his head when he couldn't sleep, the way his father's voice would hum softly as he worked on little projects around their tiny apartment. A lump formed in his throat. Leaving the city felt like saying goodbye to them all over again. The distant sound of the approaching train broke through his thoughts, and he blinked, straightening as the sleek silver engine came into view. The gentle rumble beneath his feet grew stronger, a reminder that his time here was coming to an end. He bent down, lifting his holdall and gripping it tightly as the train slowed to a stop. The doors hissed open, and for a moment he hesitated. This was it. The voice of the station announcer echoed faintly overhead, blending with the low murmur of the handful of other passengers boarding. Aki stepped forward, his tail swaying nervously as he approached the open door. He turned back, one last glance at the city he was leaving behind. The towering buildings, the smog-filled skyline, the endless noise. It had been his prison for so long. But now, standing here on the brink of something new, he felt a flicker of gratitude. The city had shaped him, for better or worse. It had taught him to endure, to dream of more, and to recognize kindness when he found it. He stepped onto the train, finding an empty seat by the window. As the doors slid shut, a quiet hum filled the carriage. Aki placed his holdall on the seat beside him and leaned back, his satchel clutched in his lap. The train lurched forward, and Aki's heart raced as the platform began to slip away. The city soon faded into the distance, its jagged skyline swallowed by the rolling countryside. He rested his head against the cool glass, watching the world blur past. His mind wandered to Bramblewick, the cafe, the little room above it, the sea stretching out into infinity. For the first time in his life, he felt the stirrings of a future he could call his own. Tears prickled at the corners of his eyes, but they weren't from sadness. As the train sped toward the horizon, carrying him toward a life filled with possibility, Aki allowed himself to hope. And for now, that was more than enough. The end.